The car hit the ice doing 60, not an accident. They made it happen. 3 cops, 1 detective who knew too much, and a river black enough to swallow everything: the evidence, the woman, the truth. She wasn't supposed to surface. She wasn't supposed to be found. But someone did find her, and he is the last man on earth these dirty cops should have touched. If you're new here, hit subscribe and don't move. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The river had no name on any local map that mattered. Greyhaven residents simply called it the Black Cut, a narrow, fast-moving stretch of water that ran beneath Route 9 before it widened and slowed into the forest, eventually dying somewhere in the dark where no road followed. In January, the Black Cut froze from the edges inward, forming a shell of ice that looked solid from the bank, but was never more than 3 inches thick at the center channel. Every few winters, a deer wandered out and broke through. Buddy went in after them. That was just how it was. Detective Mara Ellison had lived in Greyhaven for 6 years. She knew about the Black Cut. She'd driven Route 9 100 times. On a clear night, with headlights, she might have seen the warning markers in time. But this wasn't a clear night, and the men behind her had already killed the lights on their vehicles. She was doing 63 miles per hour when the embankment disappeared beneath her rear tires. The cruiser went sideways, first a slow, horrible rotation that her hands couldn't correct because the wheel had already lost contact with anything real. The nose dropped. The windshield filled with black sky, then black water, then white, a millisecond explosion of white as the front end shattered through 18 inches of surface ice, and the river swallowed the car whole. The cold hit her like electricity. Not gradual, not creeping. Immediate, a full-body voltage that seized her lungs mid-breath and turned her fingers into wood inside of 4 seconds. The seatbelt locked against her chest. Water poured in through the cracked windshield in a solid black curtain, and the cruiser was already tilting, the current catching the undercarriage and dragging the vehicle sideways beneath the surface. Mara had run through water egress training twice in her career, both times in a heated pool in Billings, with an instructor standing 10 feet away. Nothing about this was that. She got the belt on the 3rd try. Her hand found the door handle. It opened 6 inches before the pressure differential slammed it shut and held it shut. And she understood in that specific animal way that bypasses all rational thought that she was going to have to push through water that didn't want to let her go. She pushed anyway. The current took her the moment she cleared the vehicle. Beneath the ice, there was no up, no reference. The water was black in every direction, and the cold had already begun dismantling her ability to think in complete sequences. She could feel the shutdown starting at her extremities, working inward, patient and systematic in the way that cold always is. Her boots were heavy. Her jacket was a sea anchor. Somewhere above her, ice solid, continuous, no seam, no break. She hit it with her palm, and it didn't flex. She hit it again. Think. Stop thinking, move. The current pushed her eastward. She stopped fighting it. She let it take her, and kept her palm against the ice ceiling, sliding, reading the surface with numb fingers, the way a blind person reads a door looking for the handle. No, she was almost out. The thought had already formed that she was almost out of time when her hand dropped through open air. A crack, 18 inches wide. Not enough to climb through, but enough to get her face above the waterline. She got one breath, one full, ragged, desperate breath of January air. Then she heard boots on ice above her. Voice low, controlled, panic in it at all. Give me your hand. She didn't see him clearly until she was on the bank. He was big, not in obvious performative way, but in the way that functional bodies are big. Kind of build that comes from carrying weight over long distances rather than lifting it in a room. Late 30s, dark jacket, no insignia. He had a fixed blade knife in his left hand that he'd used to cut a purchase point in the ice, and a length of cordage looped around his forearm. His dog, a Belgian Malinois, coiled and silent, sat 6 feet away on the bank, watching the tree line. Watching Mara. Watching the tree line. That detail would matter later. Can you walk? The man said. Yes. She wasn't sure that was true. We need to move. Can you walk right now? Yes. She made it true. He didn't help her up. He offered his forearm, let her grip it, and use it as leverage, but he didn't pull, didn't baby her. The moment she was upright, he was already moving. angling away from the road, back into the trees. The dog fell in beside him without a command. Mara looked back toward the embankment. Through the snow and the darkness she could see headlights, 2 sets, parked on Route 9, above the crash site. Moving, not descending to help, watching. She turned and followed the man into the trees. His name was Caleb Mercer. She learned that later, inside, when warmth had become something she could process again, instead of just desperately chase. The cabin was set back 300 yards from the river, accessed by a trail that wasn't on any county map Mara had seen. Exterior lights. Wood siding weathered to the color of bark. From 20 feet away in the dark, you wouldn't have registered it as a structure at all. That wasn't an accident, she understood that much, even through the hypothermia fog. Inside, wood stove already burning, which meant he'd had it going before he left, which meant he planned for the possibility of not coming back warm. A small kitchen, a main room with a hand-built table and 2 mismatched chairs. Tactical gear on hooks near the door, organized, not decorative. A radio on the shelf, the kind that worked when cell towers didn't. And a child's drawings pinned to the wall beside the stove. Horses, mostly, one that was clearly a dog. Sophie, Caleb said, without turning around. He was crouched at the stove, adding a log. She's 7. She's in the back room. She knows to stay there until I come get her. She knows that protocol? She knows a lot of things kids her age don't usually need to know. He stood, looked at Mara directly for the first time in adequate light. You're a cop detective, Greyhaven PD, and the people in the vehicles up on Route 9. Also cops. He didn't react. Not visibly. He crossed to the shelf beside the radio, pulled down a wool blanket and a dry flannel shirt, set them on the table without ceremony. Get your jacket off. Get changed. I'll make something hot. I need to tell you what's happening. I know something bad is happening, Caleb said. You can brief me while you're not dying of hypothermia. In that order. His daughter brought soup. Sophie Mercer appeared in the doorway to the back hallway at exactly the moment her father lifted the pot from the stovetop, as if she'd been listening for the sound of it, which she probably had. She was small for 7, with dark eyes that were too serious for her age, and an unnerving quality of stillness. She carried the bowl with both hands and set it in front of Mara without spilling a drop. Thank you, Mara said. Sophie studied her face the way children study things they haven't categorized yet. You were in the river, Sophie said. Yeah, Koda found you. Mara looked at the Malinois. He was lying near the door, head up, ears forward, still watching the door now instead of the tree line. But the same absolute attention. He did, Mara said. He saved my life. Sophie seemed to accept this as a fair and complete answer. She looked at her father. Is she staying? For tonight, Caleb said. Kay. Sophie disappeared down the hallway without another word, and Mara had the distinct feeling she'd just been evaluated and provisionally approved. She told him everything. Not the sanitized version, not the version she'd have given a supervisor or a federal contact, the real version, in order including the parts that made her look bad, because she was in a stranger's cabin wearing a dead woman's flannel shirt, and the time for managed disclosure had evaporated in the river. 6 weeks ago, Mara had been working a routine narcotics case, a distribution network, operating through 3 counties in northwestern Montana. Small stuff on paper. Local dealers, regional suppliers, the usual architecture. But the money wasn't moving the way local drug money moved. The sums were too large, the transfers too sophisticated, and there were names attached to shell accounts that she recognized from legitimate contexts. Business licenses, property records, a county commissioner's re-election campaign. She'd flagged it to her shift supervisor. Standard procedure. Her shift supervisor had flagged it to Commander Victor Harlan. And 48 hours later, Mara's case files had been reclassified. Her informant had stopped returning calls, and she'd started noticing a vehicle dark blue, county plates parked within sight of her apartment, 3 separate times in 1 week. Instead of reporting it up, Caleb said, "There was no up left," Mara said. "Harlan is the up. He runs the department. The department funds the county task force. The task force is supposed to be investigating exactly the kind of network I found, which means the people supposed to be investigating it are running it or covering for it. I couldn't tell you exactly where the line was. Still can't." She wrapped both hands around the soup bowl. "I started pulling threads on my own time. financial records, shipment logs. There's a warehouse outside Greyhaven, registered to a property management company that doesn't exist. I found photographs. Chain of custody going back 18 months. Physical copies? Backed up to 3 locations. One of them federal. Caleb nodded slowly. But Harlan doesn't know about the federal backup. I don't think so. He moved on me too fast for it to have been a clean operation. This felt reactive. She paused. Was trying to make it look like an accident. Car off a road in a snowstorm. Happens every winter. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Was sitting in the chair across from her, forearms on his knees, and he had a quality of stillness about him that was different from his daughter's. Hers was the stillness of a processing a large world. His was something you earn. How many were in the vehicles? I saw at least 4. Could be more staged elsewhere. They had eyes on the crash site. They were waiting to confirm. Yes. Then they know you got out, he said. They saw me pull you. The fire popped in the stove. Koda's ears pivoted toward the window, then relaxed. Necessarily, Mara said. It was dark. They were up on the embankment. I don't know how good their sight lines were. If they're professional enough to run a network for 18 months without getting caught, Caleb said, they had good sight lines. She didn't argue. He stood, moved to the window, not standing in front of it, standing beside a shoulder to the wall, looking out through the edge of the glass. An old habit. The specific body positioning of someone who learned early that silhouettes in windows attract bullets. You need to understand something, Mara said. These aren't guys who are going to stop. Harlan has everything to lose. He's not going to assume I drowned and move on. He's going to send people back. Caleb wasn't looking at her. His eyes were still on the dark outside. I know. This isn't your problem. I can leave right now. I'll take my chances in the woods. You can't walk 2 miles without losing toes. You're still hypothermic, and I'll manage. You wouldn't make it to the county. She knew that was true. She hated that it was true. So what do you want to do? She said. He turned from the window. Right now, I want to let you sleep for 4 hours because you need it, and I need you functional. We'll talk about what happens next. He moved toward the back hallway, stopped. The emergency shelter is under the trapdoor in the kitchen. The entrance is under the rug next to the stove. It's got supplies, a separate radio frequency, and a second exit point that comes up 60 yards east in the tree line. Looked at the kitchen. Looked at the rug. You built a bolt hole under your cabin. I built several things, Caleb said simply, and disappeared down the hallway. She didn't sleep. She tried. She lay on the cot. Caleb had set up near the stove with the wool blanket pulled to her chin and her body slowly remembering how to be warm, and she watched the firelight move on the ceiling. And she thought about Victor Harlan. She'd worked under him for 4 years, had shaken his hand at 2 award ceremonies, had accepted case assignments from him, eaten lunch in the same break room, navigated the ordinary institutional friction of a small department under a man who was fundamentally good at performing competence. He was organized. He was decisive. He mentored young officers with the specific attentiveness that builds loyalty faster than anything else. And he had been running a narcotics and money laundering network for at least 3 years, probably longer. Routing product through Greyhaven because Greyhaven was small enough to control, and large serve as a regional entrance. No, using the department's own intelligence infrastructure to anticipate federal interest and stay one's its asset. She wondered how many of the other officers knew. She wondered if her shift supervisor had picked up the phone to warn Harlan out of fear or out of complicity. She wondered if there was anyone left in the department she could call. She already suspected the answer. Koda padded over at some point after midnight and lay down beside the cot without being invited. His warmth against her side was specific and real in a way that the blanket wasn't, and she was more grateful for it than she would have admitted to anyone. She watched the ceiling, thought about the photograph she'd taken of a shipping manifest inside that warehouse. Thought about the name on the manifest that had made her stomach drop in a way she still hadn't fully processed, because it wasn't a local name. It wasn't a county-level name. It was a name that suggested the network wasn't local or county-level at all. It was layered, multi-jurisdictional, the kind of infrastructure that takes years and very deliberate institutional protection to build. Harlan hadn't built this alone. That thought was still circling when she heard Caleb's footsteps in the hall, Stacy. Not the footsteps of a man who just woke up, but of a man who hadn't slept, who was moving through his own house with the specific quiet of someone used to moving without being heard. Appeared in the kitchen doorway. Looked at her. "You're awake," he said. Never wasn't. He crossed to the radio, turned it on low, ran through 2 frequencies before settling on a local dispatch channel. Listened. His expression didn't change. "They've put out a welfare check," he said. "Missing officer. Cruiser went off Route 9 in the storm. Search and rescue deploying at first light." That's Harlan's narrative. Accident, victim missing, recovery operation. Mara sat up. He'll have his people embedded in the search. When they find me, they won't find you through official channels. They'll find you. Canvass the road. You're 300 yards off Route 9, off a trail that isn't marked. Trails still exist. Caleb turned off the radio, looked at her with something flat and evaluative in his face, not cold, exactly, but the expression of a man running calculations. "You said you had evidence, backed up to a federal location. A contact at the FBI field office in Missoula. Agent Priya Sandhu. She has a sealed digital package. The trigger is me calling a specific number and confirming a passphrase." Mara paused. "If I call and don't confirm, or if I don't call within a defined window, she opens it and reports up." "When does the window close?" 48 hours from when I said it, which was yesterday afternoon. "So you have 30-something hours." "Approximately. Then we need to get you to a phone that Harlan can't trace." He turned back toward the hallway. "There's one possibility." But first he stopped. Koda was on his feet, growling, standing, perfectly still, head up and angled toward the north wall. The posture that came before the growl. The posture that meant something was already close. Caleb crossed the room in 4 steps, extinguished the lantern, moved to the window in the dark. Mara was already up, already moving toward the kitchen, toward the rug, toward the trapdoor she'd noted but hoped never to need. Outside, headlights. Not on the county road. Closer than that. Moving through the trees on the access trail, which meant someone had found the trail, which meant they'd been looking harder and faster than either of them had calculated. 2 vehicles. Possibly 3. Caleb turned from the window. In the dark, his voice was barely above a breath. "Wake Sophie up. Get her dressed. Don't turn on any lights. Go." Mara went. What happened next took 11 minutes. Though it felt both shorter and much, much longer. Caleb dressed in the dark, cold gear, boots, the jacket from the hook by the door. He pulled a locked case from beneath the bed in his room, opened it with a key from his belt, removed what he needed, secured the case. He checked his phone, no signal. He checked the radio, dispatch traffic, routine, nothing to suggest the approaching vehicles were coordinating with official channels, which meant they were off book. Which meant Harlan had sent men who would not stop at standard protocols. He moved through his own house, in total darkness by memory, touching doorframes and countertops without looking, the way you only navigate a space when you've practiced, navigating it in the dark because you know someday you might have to. He pulled the curtain on the back window and looked out, tree line, 30 yards, the snow between the cabin and the trees an open kill zone, if the men coming knew what they were doing. He looked at the open kill zone and planned. Mara appeared behind him, with Sophie, the child, dressed, boots on, a small pack on her back that she'd clearly assembled herself, which meant Caleb had prepped it for her at some point, and she knew where it lived. Crying. No questions. Sophie's face was serious, and her eyes were tracking her father's face the way children track parents for permission to be afraid on tape. Caleb looked at her, nodded once. She nodded back. "There's a trapdoor in the kitchen," he said to Mara, low. "But the tunnel's the secondary route, use it. If I'm not back before they reach the door. Northeast bearing from the exit point 60 yards, you'll find a marked cache. Sophie knows the marker. You're going outside. I'm going to see what I'm dealing with." 4 minutes, he said. And then he was gone through the back window, low and fast, into the snow. 3 men, possibly a 4th waiting in the sent vehicle as a rover or blocker. 2 moved toward the front approach. 1 circled toward the east side of the structure. Professional spacing, not SWAT, not military, but trained. Harlan had chosen officers who knew how to move. Caleb watched them from the tree line. He counted. He noted the weapons, long guns on 2 of them, sidearm visible on the 3rd. He noted the radio. The lead man keyed twice without transmitting, which meant he was checking signals with someone. He noted that none of them were moving with the urgency of men who knew their target was inside and armed. They thought they were coming to a quiet cabin. A man and his kid. Easy. He let them think it. He circled back to the cabin's front approach before the lead man reached the porch, knocked twice on the front door in a specific pattern, and opened it himself. Then he turned on the porch light and waited. The lead man stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Badge out Greyhaven PD, which Mara had warned him meant nothing, and the specific flat expression of an officer who was performing procedure he had no intention of honoring. Evening, Caleb said. He was leaning against the doorframe, weapon visible. Just a man in a flannel shirt who looked like he'd been woken up. I'm Officer Denton, Greyhaven PD. We're conducting a search in connection with a missing officer. Vehicle went off the road up on Route 9 earlier this evening. You heard anything? Seen anything unusual? Heard the storm, Caleb said. We have a report of someone in the area near the river. Who reported it? A pause, brief but real. Concerned citizen. Can I ask who else is in the home? My daughter. She's 7. She's asleep. He let a beat pass, has been since 9. Denton looked at the cabin, looked at Caleb. His eyes were doing math. Mind if we take a look inside? Just a precaution. Yeah, Caleb said, I do mind. Sir, you got a warrant? This is a welfare check.
On who?
Me? I'm fine. My daughter's fine. I haven't seen anything, and I don't consent to a search. He kept his voice level, aggressive, not hostile, just immovable. You want to come inside my home, you come back with paper. Denton held his gaze for a long moment. Behind him, the 2 other officers had stopped moving, a micro-hesitation that Caleb tracked without looking directly at them. Denton nodded. Slow, deliberate. Appreciate your time, he said. Sorry to wake you. Not a problem, Caleb said. He watched them walk back to their vehicles. He watched the vehicles reverse and navigate back down the trail without turning around. He watched their taillights disappear into the trees. Then he stepped back inside, closed the door, locked it, and stood in the dark of his own entryway for exactly 4 seconds. They're gone, he said, loud enough to carry to the kitchen. For now, Mara's voice came back from beneath the floor. For now, he agreed. He moved to the window, watched the dark. His hands were completely still. Outside, the snow was still falling, thick and indifferent, covering tracks and roads and the black crack in the river ice where a woman had surfaced and a man had decided, in the span of approximately 90 seconds, that his quiet life was over. Koda moved to his side. Caleb looked at the dog, looked at the window. Somewhere out there, Victor Harlan was listening to Officer Denton's radio report. And when Harlan heard that report, when he heard no confirmed visual, no evidence, subject unknown, knew exactly what the commander would do next. He wouldn't send 3 men back. He'd send a team, and he'd send them before sunrise. Caleb looked at his watch. It was 2:47 in the morning. He had at best 3 hours. He turned from the window and said, quietly to no one in particular, "We need to talk." From the kitchen, the trapdoor opened, and someone he'd intervened. And somewhere deeper in the house, a 7-year-old girl who knew where her father's emergency cash was buried was already lacing her second boot. The trapdoor hinges didn't squeak. Caleb had oiled them 3 weeks ago, along with every other hinge, every window latch, every door mechanism in the cabin that might make noise at the wrong moment. That was the kind of thing he did on Sunday afternoons while Sophie drew horses at the kitchen table, quiet maintenance of a quiet system that he hoped he'd never need and had always known he would. Came up first. Then she reached back down, and Sophie climbed up on her own, pack still on her back, boots tied, expression neutral, in the way children's expressions go neutral when they've processed fear and come out the other side into something steadier. She looked at her father. He was already at the table with a topographic map unfolded across it, the same map Mara had noticed earlier on the shelf beside the radio, not a commercial hiking map. A proper survey topo with elevation lines and watershed markings and notations in pencil that hadn't come printed. Caleb had annotated it himself. Trails, cache points, egress routes, timing estimates written in small, precise numbers along the margins. Mara stood across the table and looked at it and felt something shift in her read of this man. She'd been operating on the assumption that he was a capable civilian. Ex-military, clearly the gear, the bolt hole, The way he'd handled Denton at the door, without a single unnecessary word. But capable civilians existed. Veterans lived quiet lives all the time, without that meaning anything operationally specific. She told herself that what she was seeing was residual training, muscle memory, a man who'd been cautious once and hadn't fully let it go. Looking at the map, she revised that assessment. This wasn't residual. This was current. This was a man who had looked at his terrain and his variables and his risks and built contingencies, plural, in pencil, updated them, and memorized them well enough that he could pull the map out at 3 in the morning and immediately know which notation he was looking for. "How far is the county road from the eastern cache exit?" she said. 4 miles. There's a secondary trail that cuts the road at a culvert crossing. It won't be plowed, but it'll be passable. On foot? On foot, he looked up at her. "You said Sandu, FBI Field Office, Missoula. You have a number?" "I have it memorized. There's a landline at Pine Watch Ranger Station, 14 miles north. It runs on a dedicated line not routed through county infrastructure." He put his finger on the map. "Warren Hale runs it. He's been the ranger there for 22 years. He has no relationship with Greyhaven PD. You know him? We've talked. He's solid." "Solid how?" Caleb looked at her for a moment with the specific patience of a man deciding how much explanation is necessary. "Solid in that he doesn't owe Victor Harlan anything, and he has enough sense to know when something is wrong." He folded the map on the existing creases, the practiced fold of someone who'd done it in the dark, in the field, with cold hands, and slid it into his jacket's interior pocket. "That's as much as I can give you right now." Sophie was sitting on the kitchen counter, eating a piece of bread she'd found herself. She was watching the conversation without appearing to watch it. "Are we going to the ranger station?" she said. "Maybe," Caleb said. "I've been there twice. I know you have. Mr. Hale has a cat." "Sophie, just saying." She took another bite of bread and looked at Mara. "His name is Sergeant the cat." Mara looked at the girl. Something about that, the cat named Sergeant, offered as a small thread of normalcy in a 3A. Kitchen with a topographic map disappearing into her father's jacket hit Mara in a place she wasn't ready for. She turned back to the window. "We have 3 hours," she said. "Maybe less." "Then we should stop talking about the cat," Caleb said, and moved to the gear hooks by the door. He dressed Sophie in layers with the efficiency of a man who had done it in cold, in dark, in hurry before. Base layer, fleece mid-layer, wind shell on top. Wool hat pulled down over her ears. Gloves rated 20 below. He checked the pack on her back, redistributed weight without comment, tightened the shoulder straps, and then crouched in front of her and looked at her face. "You remember the bearing from the east exit," he said. "Northeast. You said 60 yards to the marked tree." "The marker, 3 cuts on the east face, low, medium, high." She paused. "And the cache is 18 inches down, on the north side of the root ball." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood without saying anything else, because there was nothing else to say, and crossed to the gear hooks and started putting on his own kit. Watched this exchange and did not speak. She was not a parent. She had no reference point for what it looked like to prepare a 7-year-old for a nighttime egress through a Montana forest in January. She suspected it looked like what she was watching, precise and practiced and quietly devastating. She put on the spare jacket Caleb had left on the chair without being asked. It was 2 sizes too large and smelled like wood smoke. She found gloves in the left pocket that had been forgotten. There, pulled them on. Her service weapon was gone, lost in the river with the cruiser. She had her badge, her ID, and the memorized phone number for an FBI agent in Missoula who might or might not still be reachable on a line. Harlan couldn't monitor. 3 things. It wasn't much. She thought about whether to tell Caleb about the name on the shipping manifest, the name that suggested this went higher than a county commander. She decided to hold it a little longer. Not because she didn't trust him, because information had weight, and she wanted to know what he was before she handed him anything more to carry. "Koda," Caleb said quietly. The Malinois came off the floor and fell in beside him without ceremony. "Let's go," Caleb said to the room, and they went. The tunnel was 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, lined with pressure-treated lumber, approximately 40 yards long. A single red lens flashlight hung on a hook at the entrance. Caleb took it without turning it on for the first 30 feet, navigating by the slight blue ambient that filtered through the snow-covered exit hatch at the far end. He moved point. Koda was behind him, Sophie behind Koda. At the rear, nobody spoke. At the exit hatch, Caleb stopped. He pressed his palm flat against the wood and held it there for 10 full seconds. Then he pressed his ear to it. Then he cracked it a half-inch and held that for another 5. He pushed it open. Cold air dropped into the tunnel like a physical weight. Outside the tree line, exactly as advertised, 60 yards of open snow before the forest closed around them. Lights, no silhouettes. The snow was still coming down, fine and wind-driven, which was bad for warmth and good for covering tracks. He scanned right, scanned left, looked back at Sophie and held up 2 fingers. She nodded. He went out first, 5 steps, crouched, scanned again. He waved them through. They crossed the open ground in single file, stepping in his footprints, and the trees took them. The cache was where Sophie said it was. The marked tree was an old ponderosa at the edge of a dry creek bed. 3 axe cuts on the east face, exactly as described, the lowest cut at knee height. Caleb dropped to one knee, brushed snow from the base, found the north side of the root ball, measured 18 inches with the span of his hand, and started digging with the folding and trenching tool he'd pulled from inside his jacket. Mara stood with her back to the operation, watching the forest. She didn't have a weapon. She did it anyway, because standing watch was still more useful than watching someone dig. The cache was a dry bag inside a hard plastic case, inside a waterproof military surplus ammo can. Caleb opened it without commentary. Food dense, caloric, the kind of bars designed for cold weather output rather than enjoyment. A first aid kit, a change of dry clothing in a vacuum-sealed compression bag. Cash, she couldn't see the denomination, but the stack was substantial. A prepaid satellite communicator, small, the size of a deck of cards. And at the bottom of the dry bag, wrapped in an oilcloth, a compact handgun, a spare magazine, and a small box of ammunition. Loaded the weapon without looking at it, seated the magazine, chambered a round, engaged the safety, tucked it into his waistband. He looked at Mara. "You want the second magazine or the spare?" he said. She stared at him. "I don't have a holster. Right jacket pocket. It'll sit fine." She took the spare magazine. It was for a caliber she didn't recognize. "Is that .380? It's not a service weapon, but it'll work." "Where did you—" She stopped herself. "Never mind." "Good call," he said, and turned back to the cache. Sophie was sitting on the ammo can eating a protein bar, with the same methodical calm she'd applied to the bread in the kitchen. Koda had moved 10 yards into the trees and was doing slow sweeps, nose low, and Mara watched him and thought, that dog isn't just trained. That dog is operational. Was a distinction she was still adding to her running total of things she'd underestimated about Caleb Mercer. She pulled her collar higher against the wind. "Tell me about your contact," Caleb said. He was inventorying the remaining cache items, deciding what to carry and what to leave. "How confident are you she's clean?" 90%. "What's the 10%? "She's been in the Missoula field office for 8 months. She transferred from Denver. I don't know who she talked to when she got here, who she's built relationships with, whether any of those relationships overlap with Harlan's network." She paused. But the sealed package protocol was her idea, not mine. The trigger mechanism was designed to be tamper-resistant if Harlan had gotten to her. The safest play would have been to open the package immediately and get ahead of it, not sit on it. Unless she's waiting to see if he cleans up his side first. That's the 10%. Caleb closed the cache case, looked at the tree line in a long, sweeping visual that wasn't random. He was moving his gaze in a pattern, she realized, breaking the forest into sectors and checking each one. "Either way," he said, "we need to make contact before the window closes. 14 miles to Pine Watch. On foot in this terrain and this temperature, 5 to 6 hours. Have 5 to 6 hours. I know." He stood, shouldered the pack. "There's a vehicle. But to reach it, we need to cross the access road, which Harlan's people may be watching. Which Harlan's people are definitely watching." He looked at her. "Which is why we're going to do it at the one point on that road where a vehicle running without lights, in the dark, in a snowstorm, can make a crossing without being seen for approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds. It's a curve. If we time it right." She held up a hand. "I don't need the full brief. I just need to know if you've done something like this before. He didn't answer right away. He looked at Sophie, who had finished her protein bar and folded the wrapper into a precise square and put it in her jacket pocket, because apparently her father had taught her not to leave trace. He looked at Mara. Yeah, he said. I've done something like this before. He said it the way people say things they've never particularly wanted to be true. The access road crossing took 7 minutes to set up and 4 seconds to execute. Caleb had them wait in the trees 30 yards from the road while he went forward alone, low, moving in a crouch that kept him beneath the sightline of a vehicle parked on the straight section 200 yards north. She could see the parked vehicle from her position, engine running, exhaust vapor rising, one officer visible in the driver's seat. The second officer was somewhere she couldn't see, which was worse. Caleb was at the road edge for 90 seconds. Then he came back. Second man is on foot north side, moving a slow patrol loop. Approximately 8 minutes per circuit. He looked at his watch. We go in 4 minutes. Fast walk. Not a run leaves a different sound signature in the snow. You hear me give 2 short clicks. He showed her the small device in his palm, a push-button clicker, the kind used in dog training. That's the signal. Sophie goes first. You, then Koda, then me. Stop in the road. If they see us, keep moving. Get Sophie to the trees on the other side and get low. His voice was flat and unhurried. I'll handle the problem. She wanted to ask what that meant. She looked at his face and decided the answer was visible enough already. 4 minutes passed with the specific slowness of 4 minutes in the cold when you're waiting. 2 clicks. Sophie went. Seven-year-old legs moving through 8 inches of snow with the serious, deliberate effort of a child who understood exactly how important it was to not fall. She made it across in 12 steps. She reached the opposite tree line and turned and looked back with an expression that was not fear, not excitement, something more complicated than either. Went next. The road surface was compacted ice under the snow, and her boot found the slick spot on the step, and she went down on one knee, and for 1 full second she was in the open on an icy road with a corrupt police officer 200 yards away, and she felt every one of those yards as a specific physical reality. She got up. She kept moving. The trees on the other side received her like cold hands. Koda crossed in 4 long strides. Caleb came last, and he came the way Koda came, too fast and too quiet for a man his size, covering the distance with a rolling stride that made almost no sound in the snow. And then he was in the tree line, and the road was empty, and the patrol vehicle's exhaust vapor was still rising into the dark sky, as if nothing had moved at all. He didn't check to see if they were okay. He was already moving north, the direction of the vehicle, and Mara pulled Sophie up beside her and followed. The vehicle was a dark green truck 10 years old, parked off a logging spur under a tarp that had been staked down with the same precision as everything else on this property. Plates, or rather, the plates were there, but covered with a magnetic panel that could be swapped in 30 seconds. Caleb pulled the tarp, folded it in 4 efficient motions, and stuffed it behind the back seat, then lifted Sophie into the cab and started the engine. It started on the first try. Of course it did. You maintained it, Mara said, climbing into the passenger seat. 2 weeks, engine, fluids, tires. For how long? 2 years. She looked at him across the cab. The interior was dark. He hadn't turned on the dome light, and in the residual glow from the dash, she could see the set of his jaw and the particular quality of his attention, which was always forward, always scanning. Caleb, she said. Yeah, who were you? He put the truck into reverse and eased back onto the spur road without turning on the headlights, navigating by the pale contrast between the snow-covered track and the darker trees on either side. Just a guy trying to raise his kid, he said. And that was all he said about it. They drove north. The road to Pinwatch was a Forest Service 2-lane that hadn't seen a plow in 36 hours. Caleb ran it at 30 miles per hour with the headlights on low, fast enough to cover ground, slow enough to manage the ice on the curves. Sophie fell asleep against his arm somewhere around mile 3. Mara found both heartbreaking and oddly reassuring. Only a child conditioned to trust her environment unconditionally could fall asleep in a moving truck at 4 in the morning while being pursued by corrupt police officers. Watch the mirrors. Nothing followed them. Not yet. She thought about what came next. Pinwatch, a landline, Sandu. If the FBI contact was clean, the sealed package would be released, and whatever federal infrastructure had been monitoring Harlan's network, and she believed something had been, networks at this scale didn't survive without someone at a higher level, either protecting them or watching them, would have enough to move. The problem was timeline. Federal operations didn't move in hours. They moved in days, sometimes weeks, and Harlan would not wait days. She thought about the name on the manifest. Again. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said. The truck's wipers swept once across the windshield. "Okay," Caleb said. "The shipping manifest I found at the warehouse. There was a name on it that doesn't belong to anyone local. It's a logistics company registered in Helena. But the principal officer on the registration is a name I recognized from a federal database cross-reference. I ran 8 months ago on a different case that was subsequently closed by order of the state attorney general's office." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You think this goes above county level?" "I think it goes above state level. I think Harlan has coverage from somewhere that isn't Greyhaven, and I think that coverage is the real reason this network has survived 3 years without a federal interdiction." She paused. "And I think if that's true, Sandhu's sealed package might hit a wall above the field office level before it goes anywhere. Why are we going to use it? Because it's the only play we have right now. And because even if it hits a wall, the act of hitting the wall will tell me where the wall is." She looked at him. "Also because if we don't call before the window closes, Sandhu opens it automatically, and we lose control of the narrative." Slow, once. "Is that a problem?" he said. "Losing control of the narrative. It is if the people who get to define the narrative are the same ones who tried to put me in a river." He didn't argue with that. They drove another mile in silence. The forest's sides was dense and dark, and the headlights carved a pale tunnel through it that closed behind them the moment they passed. "Sophie doesn't know," he said abruptly. Mara looked at him. "Any of this? About who I was?" His hands were easy on the wheel. "I was in the military. She knows her mom died. She knows we moved here because I wanted somewhere quiet." He paused. "She doesn't know why I built the tunnel. I told her it was an adventure project. She seems to understand what it's actually for." Yeah, something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. "She's too smart for the story I gave her. She just decided to let me have it." Mara thought about that. A 7-year-old girl who memorized a compass bearing and an emergency cache location, and the number of cuts on a ponderosa tree, and who folded her protein bar wrapper into a perfect square and put it in her pocket so she wouldn't leave trace, and who had looked at her father before crossing an icy road in the dark and simply nodded. "She's going to be extraordinary," Mara said. Caleb didn't answer. His jaw shifted in a way that might have been, under different circumstances, something close to pride. The truck crested a low ridge, and below them, through the trees, Mara could see a structure, a cluster of buildings, really a main station with a covered porch and 2 outbuildings, all dark except for one window that held the warm amber of an interior light burning. "Pine Watch Ranger Station. Hale keeps a light on overnight," Caleb said, reading her look. "Motion sensor on the exterior. If anyone comes up the access road, he'll know." "Does he know we're coming?" "So we're about to knock on a stranger's door at 4:30 in the morning in the middle of a blizzard. He's been the ranger here for 22 years, Caleb said. "I'm guessing this isn't the strangest thing that's happened on this road." He pulled the truck off the main track and into a stand of trees 60 yards from the station's perimeter, killed the headlights. Sophie didn't wake up. Caleb looked at her for a moment, the specific look of a parent checking on a sleeping child, which has a texture entirely different from any other kind of looking, and then he covered her with the spare jacket from behind the seat and opened his door quietly. "Stay with her," he said to Koda. The Malinois settled on the seat. Caleb got out. Mara got out. They walked through the snow toward the lit window, their breath preceding them in white clouds, the cold absolute and indifferent and thorough. Mara's phone had no signal. The satellite communicator in Caleb's pack was an option, but the call would be logged with a satellite provider, traceable in time. The landline inside was better, not perfect, but better. Every choice out here was a degree of risk management, not an elimination of risk. She'd been operating in that reality for 6 weeks. She was getting tired in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with the cold. Caleb knocked on the door. 3 knocks. Not loud. Tentative. The specific knock of a man who had a reason to be there. A pause. Movement inside. The amber light shifted. The door opened. Warren Hale was a man in his 60s who looked like he'd been grown from the same material as the forest around his station, weathered, economical, with a face that had stopped performing anything for anyone sometime in its 40s and had settled into a permanent expression of unhurried appraisal. He was in a wool shirt and canvas pants with suspenders, which meant he'd been awake. He had a mug in his right hand and nothing in his left, which Mara noted for professional reasons. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Mara. He looked at the snow behind them, which told him they'd come through the trees and not up the road. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You'd better come inside," and stepped back from the door. The station's interior was warm in the specific way of spaces heated by long habit rather than thermostat. The wood stove in the corner had been burning for hours, and the smell of it was layered with coffee and something that had been cooked earlier, and a fainter animal smell that was probably the cat. Sergeant Mara remembered. She didn't see him. Hale listened. Caleb gave him the essential version, compact and factual, while Mara stood near the stove and let the heat work on her. Hale's expression didn't change much during the telling. He asked two questions, whether Mara had physical evidence and whether Harlan knew about the federal contact, and nodded at both answers. "The landline," Mara said. "I need to make one call." "It's on the wall," Hale said and gestured. She crossed to it. Old rotary-style phone, heavy handset, the kind with a mechanical bell that rang instead of a digital tone. She picked it up and heard a dial tone, and something loosened in her chest that she hadn't realized had been wound tight. She dialed the number from memory. It rang 4 times. "It's Ellison. Confirm Alpha 7 Tango." A pause. 3 seconds. "Confirmed. You're inside the window. By how much?" 19 hours. "Are you safe?" "Temporarily. I need you to listen," without interrupting for approximately 2 minutes. Another pause. "Go ahead," Sandhu said. Mara talked. She was concise. She gave Sandhu the warehouse location, the manifest details, the shell company name, the name of the principal officer on the state registration, and her assessment of where the network's coverage might be originating above county level. She heard Sandhu typing throughout. When she was done, there was a long silence. "Ellison. Yeah. That name on the registration, I need you to understand something." Sandhu's voice had dropped slightly. "A lot. Enough. That name was flagged in a task force review 16 months ago. The review was closed out at regional director level." Mara looked at the wall in front of her. "Closed for what reason?" "The file says insufficient predication." A pause. "The agent who ran the review was transferred to the Anchorage field office 3 weeks later." The fire in the wood stove cracked and settled. "Sandhu," Mara said carefully, "are you telling me the wall is inside the building?" Long pause. "I'm telling you I'm going to make some calls," Sandhu said. "And I'm telling you to stay exactly where you are and not move until I call back. 2 hours. Maybe 3. I don't have 3 hours. Then I'll do it in 2. Another pause. "Ellison, be careful. And don't let anyone know where you are." Mara looked at Caleb, who was standing at the window with his shoulder to the wall, the same way he'd stood at his cabin window the night before. "Too late for part of that," she said. "Make it fast." She hung up. The station was quiet except for the fire. Outside, the snow was still falling. Somewhere to the south, on a mountain road that pointed like an arrow back toward Greyhaven, a man named Victor Harlan was listening to his radio and doing math, and the math was telling him something he didn't like, that Mara Ellison had survived again, that his clean operation had developed a complication, and that the complication had a face he hadn't looked at closely enough. Hale poured coffee into a mug and set it on the table in front of Mara without being asked. She sat down. She looked at Caleb. He was still at the window, still watching. And for the first time since she'd surfaced from beneath the ice, Mara Ellison allowed herself to feel something she hadn't had time for. Until that moment, not relief, not safety, not anything so complete as that. Just the careful, fragile beginning of the thought that maybe she wasn't going to have to die in these mountains to stop Victor Harlan. The coffee was hot. She wrapped both hands around the mug and held it. Outside, headlights swept across the tree line at the far end of the access road, paused, and moved on. Caleb watched them go. He didn't say anything. but his hand moved to the jacket pocket where the compact pistol was, rested there for a moment, and then came away. The headlights didn't come back. Not yet. The headlights didn't come back that hour. But Caleb didn't move from the window. Hale refilled his coffee once, said nothing about it, and went to his desk where he pulled out a logbook and began writing in it with the unhurried specificity of a man recording what he'd witnessed for reasons he didn't need to explain. Mara watched him do it and understood 22 years as a ranger meant 22 years of documenting what happened on his mountain. And what was happening on his mountain right now was going into the record whether anyone asked him to or not. Sophie was still asleep in the truck. Koda was still with her. Sat at sand. Mara sat with the coffee going cold in her hands and worked through the call with Sandu the way she worked crime scenes backward from what she knew toward what she didn't, looking for the load-bearing piece. The agent who'd flagged the name 16 months ago had been transferred within 3 weeks. Regional director-level closure. Those two facts together weren't proof of anything, but they described a shape, and the shape was familiar and ugly. Someone with institutional authority had looked at a thread connecting to Harlan's network and had decided deliberately to cut it. That someone was still in position, which meant that when Sandu started making her calls, she was going to be pulling on a wire attached to something that had teeth. Set down the coffee. Hale, she said. The ranger looked up from his logbook. If someone wanted to monitor traffic on this landline, the dedicated line you mentioned, how long would it take them to arrange it? Hale considered this with no apparent alarm. Depends who's asking the phone company, he said. County Emergency Management can request a monitor through the utility liaison. Takes about 40 minutes if the duty officer is cooperative. And if the person requesting it runs the county task force, probably 30. Mara looked at Caleb. He was already looking at her. How long ago did I make that call? She said. He checked his watch. 34 minutes. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Caleb turned from the window and crossed to the desk and said to Hale, with the same flat courtesy he used for everything, "Is there a back way out of this station?" Hale didn't argue. He didn't ask for more explanation. He stood up from his desk with the deliberate motion of a man who had lived long enough to recognize when a situation had passed the point of deliberation, and he crossed to a locked cabinet on the far wall and opened it with a key from his belt. Inside, a short-range VHF radio, a first aid kit, 2 emergency flare kits in orange canisters, a handheld GPS unit, and a double-barrel shotgun with a box of shells beside it. He took the radio, he took the GPS, he left the shotgun. Back door goes to the equipment shed, he said. Shed connects to the snowmobile track that runs north along the ridge. 4 miles up the ridge, there's an old fire lookout, white-capped tower. Hasn't been staffed in 8 years, but the structure's sound, and there's a wood stove inside that I serviced last October. He looked at Mara. If you need high ground and a 360-degree sightline, that's your best option on this mountain. What about you? Mara said. I'll stay here. He said it without any particular drama. I'm the ranger. He said that the same way. This is my station. If someone comes up that road and finds it empty, they'll know you were warned. If they find me here, they'll have to deal with me, which takes time, which is what you need. He paused. I'll be fine. Mara looked at him. She wanted to argue, and she didn't have the time for it, and she also understood, in some old professional part of herself, that this man had already made his decision, and that it was a decision that came from the same place that her own best decisions had come. From not bravado, not recklessness, but the specific calculus of a person, a prostitute who had assessed the situation and chosen the role where they could do the most good. There's a federal agent named Sandu, she said. FBI Missoula field office. If someone comes back on this line, I'll give them the name, Hale said. And this he tore a page from his logbook and folded it once and handed it to her. Everything I've written down tonight. Times, names, descriptions. Chain of events, he paused. Documentation, she took the paper. She folded it into her breast pocket and buttoned the pocket. Thank you, she said, and meant it in the way you mean things you don't have adequate language for. Hale nodded once and went to pour the rest of his coffee into a thermos. Caleb was already at the back door. The truck was where they'd left it. Sophie still asleep, Koda sitting upright in the dark cab with his ears forward and his attention absolute. He made no sound when Caleb opened the door, just shifted to allow him access. which told Caleb that nothing had approached the vehicle in the time they'd been inside. He started the engine. Sophie woke at the sound of it, not startled, just transitioning the way children do when they've trained themselves to wake clean. "Are we going?" she said. "Yeah, Mr. Hale. He's staying. He'll be okay." Sophie processed this. She looked at the station's lit window through the snow-covered windshield, and whatever she was thinking moved across her face in a brief, complicated way before she settled it. "Okay," she said. They took the snowmobile track north. Caleb drove with the headlights off for the first mile, using the track's compressed snow as a guide. It was marginally paler than the surrounding terrain, enough to follow at 15 miles per hour. Mara had the GPS unit from Hale's cabinet and was reading it against the truck's compass, calling out course corrections in a flat, quiet voice. Sophie sat between them with Koda across her lap, which was logistically impractical and which neither adult addressed. At mile 2, Caleb stopped the truck. He'd heard something with his ears, with the part of his nervous system that operated below conscious processing, the part that had been trained over years to register environmental changes before the brain had finished identifying them. He sat still for 3 seconds. Then he heard it properly. Rotors. Distant south-southwest, moving north. "Helicopter," Mara said. She'd heard it too. State police air unit or county. At 5 in the morning in a snowstorm? Thermal imaging works in a snowstorm. He put the truck in reverse, backed 30 feet into a tree break on the east side of the track, and cut the engine. Engine heat. If they're running thermal, the truck reads like a campfire. They sat in the dark and the cold and listened to the rotors move. The sound grew not rapidly, but with the steady, patient approach of a search pattern being run systematically. Mara could see the beam below the aircraft now, a white column of light sweeping in arcs across the ridgeline to their south. "They escalated," she said. "They escalated," Caleb agreed. "That's not a county helicopter." "No, county doesn't have a thermal unit." He was watching the light. A state police aircraft, which means Harlan made a call above his own jurisdiction. Or someone made it for him. The rotors peaked and then began to diminish. The aircraft was moving north on a track that would pass 200 yards east of their position. The thermal would pick up the engine heat even through the tree break if the aircraft came close enough. And Caleb was doing the spatial math in real time, measuring the distance and the tree canopy and the rate at which the engine block cooled, and they had approximately 4 minutes of safe cover before the metal under the hood stopped being an asset and became a liability. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, the rotors faded to nothing. He started the truck. "If they're running a state air asset," Mara said, "then Sandhu's calls hit something. Something moved. That's good or bad, both." She was looking at the GPS. "Turn north-northeast in 100 yards. The lookout tower should be 2 miles up the ridge." He turned where she said. The snowmobile track narrowed and steepened, and the truck's tires found the edge of their traction on the grade twice before Caleb eased the speed down and found the line that worked. It was coming heavier now, which was the one thing working in their favor. Any tracks they left on this ridge would be covered in 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes of uncertainty for anyone trying to follow their movement. The problem was what waited at the end of the ridge. The problem was that Harlan had stopped being reactive. They saw the cabin lights first. Headlights, cabin lights, plural, through the trees at the bottom of the ridge access road, which meant vehicles had come up the access road from the south while they were on the snowmobile, which meant the ranger station had been reached, which meant Hale. Mara had her hand on the door handle before she fully knew she was doing it. Caleb said, "Hale is down there. You can't help him by going back." His voice wasn't cold. It was something worse than cold, it was certain. "You go back. They take you, and everything Hale just bought us is spent for nothing." She knew he was right. She hated knowing he was right with a physical intensity that made her jaw ache. She watched the lights at the base of the ridge for another 3 seconds. Then she looked away. "Keep going," she said. He kept going. Whitecap Tower emerged from the snow and the dark with the sudden solidity of things that have been in one place for a very long time. It was a standard Forest Service fire lookout, a 15 by 15-foot cab mounted on a 40-foot timber tower, accessed by an open staircase that switched back 3 times on the way up. The cab was dark. The structure was crusted with ice on its windward faces, and the staircase railing had accumulated enough snow to make the handholds unreliable. Caleb parked the truck under the tower structure itself, which put it directly beneath the cab and out of aerial sightline, and they climbed. The door to the cab was padlocked. Caleb looked at it for a moment, then produced a small tool from his jacket pocket and had it open in 40 seconds. Mara noted this and did not comment on it. Inside, a wood stove as advertised, a cot, a table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a map board, and windows on all 4 walls. The glass was intact. The stove had wood stacked beside it and kindling in a metal box. Cold in the way of spaces that haven't been heated in months but structurally sound, and most critically, elevated 40 feet above the tree line, with unobstructed sight lines in every direction. Caleb had a fire going in 11 minutes, using the minimum amount of kindling necessary to catch the larger wood without producing a startup smoke signature that would read from a distance. Even this, the fire starting, he did with an economy of motion that spoke of repetition in contexts she was still only beginning to understand. Sophie found the cot, pulled the emergency blanket from her pack, and lay down without being told. Koda went to the east window and sat. Mara went to the south window and looked down the ridge. The cabin lights at the base were moving, spreading. She could see now, separating into individual points. A 2-vehicle search. More than that. She counted 5 distinct light sources, possibly 6. They brought a team, she said. Caleb came up beside her. 5 seconds of silence. 8, he said. That vehicle on the north side of the access road is a 3rd unit. Count the exhaust columns. She looked. He was right. 8 officers, minimum, on a mountain in a snowstorm at 5:30 in the morning. This wasn't a search operation. This was a suppression operation. The distinction was in the deployment pattern. They weren't spreading to cover ground. They were moving in a formation designed to push a target in a specific direction. About the tower, Mara said. Hale's logbook, Caleb said. He told us himself he documented everything. She closed her eyes for half a second. Then they're not searching. They're driving. Yes. Driving us up. Toward the only structure on this ridge where a person could shelter. He looked at her. This position is a trap. She looked at the windows. 40 feet up. 1 staircase. Trees on 3 sides, open ridgeline on the 4th. Why are we here? She said. Because right now it's the only position with a sight line, he said. And because I need 2 minutes to think. He turned from the window. He stood in the middle of the cab and looked at the map board on the wall. A Forest Service map, outdated. But the terrain didn't change, and he looked at it the way he'd looked at the topographic map in his cabin, which was not like a person reading a map, but like a person who was comparing a map against something already built inside his head. Watched him do it. Sophie watched him from the cot. He was quiet for 90 seconds. Not fidgety, not visibly anxious, the interior stillness of a man running a problem through an established process, checking variables, identifying constraints, finding the margin that existed between bad and worse. There's a creek bed, he said. Northeast. It runs below the ridgeline for approximately a mile before it drops into the valley on the other side. Forest Service Road intersects it at the valley floor. He put his finger on the map. If we're off this tower for 20 minutes, we can use the creek bed as a covered egress. The banks are deep enough to drop below sightline from the ridge. 20 minutes. They'll be to the tree line below us in 30. We have a 10-minute margin. We have a 10-minute margin if everything goes correctly, he said. Which it won't. She appreciated the honesty. Koda. He crossed to the east window, opened it 3 inches, and let the dog read the air for 15 seconds. Koda's nose worked rapidly. Then his ears came forward, and he looked at Caleb with the specific attention that meant presence. They're already east, Caleb said. He closed the window. They're not just driving from the south. They split the team. The margin had just become 5 minutes. Mara was already at the map. The truck, she said. Can't use it. They'll hear the engine. The truck is transport. The truck is distraction. She looked at him. If the truck moves, if it rolls, gravity, no engine down the access road south, it buys us noise and attention in a direction we're not. He looked at her. Then he looked at the window. Neutral, he said. The road's got enough grade. How far does it run before it hits the switchback? 400 yards. 400 yards of a rolling vehicle is 30 seconds of noise and light. She paused. It's enough. He didn't argue with it. Sophie, he said. She was already sitting up. We're moving fast. Are you ready? Yes, she said, and was off the cot before the word was finished. Getting down the tower staircase, in the dark with ice on the handrails, was the most immediately dangerous thing Mara had done in the last 12 hours, which was a significant statement. She went first, Caleb's instruction, with one hand on the railing and the other hand out for balance, testing each step for ice before committing weight. The staircase swayed slightly in the wind, which was structural design, not damage, but didn't feel like it. Caleb came last with Sophie on his back, her arms around his neck, his hands on the railing. At the base, he went immediately to the truck, released the handbrake, put it in neutral, and pushed it to the edge of the access road slope. It moved reluctantly at first, then the grade caught it, and then it was moving on its own, picking up speeds, the tires crunching through the snow crust, the vehicle listing slightly to the left before the road corrected it. It was loud enough. Caleb was already moving northeast. The creek bed was where the map said it was, which was the one thing that went right in the next 20 minutes without qualification. Everything else was a managed problem. The bank drop was steeper than the contour lines, suggested 6 feet of near vertical frozen earth above the creek bed, which Koda cleared in one stride, and Sophie dropped down with Caleb's hands at her waist, and Mara came down last and caught her boot on a root and landed hard on her right knee. She got up without stopping. The knee registered the impact, and she filed it under things to deal with later and kept moving. The creek bed was frozen, but not uniformly. There were sections where the ice over the moving water below was thin, and Caleb tested each section with his boot before committing, which slowed them to a pace that felt intolerable against the timeline in Mara's head. Behind them, above the bank, she could hear voices. Voices, the acoustic signature of multiple people moving through dense brush, communicating in short bursts. They were close. Koda moved point without being positioned. There, Caleb had given him one-hand signal at the top of the bank, and the dog had taken point the way he'd been trained to, moving 20 yards ahead and holding when the ice quality was questionable, which was a form of intelligence that had no tactical equivalent in anything Mara could have organized on her own. She focused on the step immediately in front of her, the one after that. The voices behind them spread. They'd found the creek bed. The formation was now moving to flank. Caleb stopped. He was listening to something she couldn't hear yet. Then she heard it, a vehicle. Not behind them. Ahead. On the Forest Service road at the valley floor, which was where the creek bed was supposed to exit. Which meant the eastern approach was also blocked. Which meant Harlan had anticipated the creek bed exit. Which meant they were being run into a closing box. Caleb looked at her. She looked back at him. How did he know? She said. The map board, Caleb said. Same as the tower. Hale Station had every Forest Service map in the district. She absorbed this. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that they had been using a dead man's information to navigate, and that the man who killed him had access to the same information. Options, she said. The South Bank, straight up. There's a gap in their formation. They moved east to cut us off, which means they're light on the south side right now. The South Bank is where their main body came from. So we run at them. We run through the gap they created by moving away from us. He looked up the bank. It's maybe 30 yards of open ground once we crest the bank. There's a stand of old timber on the south ridge, dense enough to break sight lines. Maybe 30 yards. Mara. She looked at him. If you have a better option, tell me, he said, impatiently. Just honestly. She didn't have one. Sophie goes between us, she said. Agreed. He crouched in front of his daughter. Sophie's face was pale and serious and absolutely present. What happens now, he said. We run. Don't look at anything except where you're putting your feet. When I say stop, I stop behind the nearest tree, and I get low, and I wait for you. She said it like a lesson she'd been taught and had repeated until it was automatic. He held her face in both his hands for 1 second. Good girl. He stood up. Koda. Here, he said. The German command, which Mara had heard him use twice now, always the moment before something happened. The Malinois came to heel. Caleb looked at the south bank. He said. What followed was not elegant. Mara had seen tactical movements executed cleanly in training environments, and once or twice in the field, and this was neither of those things. Caleb went up the bank with Sophie in his arms because there wasn't time to let her climb it herself, and he went up it fast, his boots cutting into the frozen earth, and Mara was a half-second behind him, and the earth gave under her second footfall, and she clawed at the root exposure above her head and made the crest on upper body strength alone, which she would feel in her shoulders for a week, if she survived to feel anything. She came over the top into open snow just as a flashlight beam swept across the ground, 20 yards to her left. She dropped. Caleb was already moving south. Low, Sophie pressed against his chest. Koda beside him in the crouch. That meant the dog was doing it on purpose. The flashlight swept back. It passed over the space where she'd been 2 seconds earlier. She got up and ran. The timber stand was 40 yards, not 30 she counted them, each one a separate decision, her right knee sending up a complaint on every other step that she acknowledged and disregarded. The voices behind her were louder. Someone was shouting not at her, at each other, the clipped command exchange of officers repositioning. She heard Koda bark once, sharp to her right. She corrected left. She hit the tree line, and the darkness of it closed around her like something solid, and she stopped and crouched and breathed and looked back. Clear ground. No visible pursuit in immediate range. The flashlight beams were moving, but moving east, chasing the sound of Koda's bark rather than the direction of their movement. The dog had done it deliberately. She was starting to understand that Koda did most things deliberately. Caleb materialized out of the dark to her left, with Sophie still against his chest and the child's face buried in his collar. And Mara had one flash of the thought that Sophie was not crying, that she hadn't cried at all in the hours since this status, and the thought did something complicated to her chest that she pushed aside. The road, Caleb said very quietly. They have a vehicle on it. One vehicle, which means 1 or 2 officers. She looked at him. You're not suggesting... I'm suggesting we need that vehicle. He held her gaze. How to do this without anyone getting hurt. She almost pointed out the chain of events that had preceded this conversation and how they complicated the phrase, without anyone getting hurt. She did not point it out. Okay, she said. What do you need me to do? What he needed her to do was create a distraction, and what she used was the only tool she had left that didn't require a weapon, her badge and her voice. She came out of the tree line onto the Forest Service road, 40 yards north of the parked vehicle, a dark blue SUV, county plates, engine running with her badge held at arm's length above her head, and she walked toward it in plain sight at a deliberate pace, not running, not creeping, just walking. Because running was what fugitives did, and she was not a fugitive. She was a detective, and she decided in the 3 seconds before the vehicle's door opened that she was going to behave as though the world had not yet finished understanding that distinction. The door opened. One officer, young, she saw as he stepped out, 26, maybe 27, the kind of young where the training hadn't yet fully integrated with the judgment. He had his hand on his sidearm, but it wasn't drawn. Stop right there, he said. Detective Mara Ellison, Greyhaven PD. She kept walking. Slower now. I need your radio. Ma'am, I need you to stop. Officer, I have been in the field for 6 hours in sub-zero temperatures, pursuing an armed suspect, and I need your radio right now. What's your name? Reyes, ma'am, but Commander Harlan has ordered. Commander Harlan said, and now she did stop, 8 feet from Officer Reyes, and she looked at him with the specific expression she'd spent 6 years developing for situations that required one officer to communicate to another that they were standing on the wrong side of something is going to federal prison. And how you answer the next question I ask you is going to determine whether you go with him. Reyes stared at her. His hand was still on his sidearm, drawing it, just resting there, which meant he hadn't made the decision yet, which meant he was still the kind of person who made decisions. What question? He said. From behind him and to the left, at the driver's side door that he'd left open, Caleb stepped out of the tree line in complete silence. The driver's door, the rear door, which Reyes had checked once and dismissed, because people approaching vehicles approached from the front. Caleb came through the rear with one specific motion, took the radio handset from the center console, killed the vehicle's radio, and removed the keys from the ignition with the smooth sequencing of someone who had disabled more complex systems than this in considerably less time. Reyes heard none of it. Mara held his attention for 3 more seconds. Caleb said quietly, "From inside the vehicle, officer." Reyes spun, saw Caleb standing at the rear of the SUV holding the keys, saw the radio in his other hand, saw Sophie stepping out of the trees to the south. His hand moved back from his sidearm. Not a retreat, a recalculation. "Who are you?" he said to Caleb. "Somebody who pulled that detective out of a river last night after your commander tried to drown her." Caleb set the keys on the roof of the vehicle. "You can have those back when we're clear. Your radio's dead. You've got a phone. I'm guessing it'll work. If you hike back toward the tower, you'll get signal on the ridge." Reyes looked at the keys, looked at Mara, looked at Caleb. "Harlan said you were a suspect," he said to Mara. "Harlan said a lot of things. Some of them are in my pocket right now, documented, with a federal agent's name attached." She paused. "Make a decision, Reyes. You've got maybe 3 minutes before your colleagues come through those trees, and the decision gets made for you by proximity." A long moment. Reyes stepped back from the vehicle. Caleb picked the keys up off the roof. They were in the SUV and moving south in 90 seconds, and behind them, a young officer stood alone on a Forest Service road in a snowstorm, holding his phone and waiting for a signal bar to appear, which was exactly where they needed him to be. The SUV had better traction than the truck and a full tank, which were the two things that mattered most in the next 4 miles. Caleb drove. Mara was on the radio, not the vehicle's radio, which was dead, but the satellite communicator from the cache, which she'd been unwilling to use until now because satellite calls left logs. The calculation had changed. Everything had changed. Sandhu picked up on the second ping. "I need to know what's happening on your end," Mara said. "It's happening." Sandhu sounded different from the call at the station, tighter. The specific compression of someone managing multiple active lines simultaneously. "The name you gave me, the registration principal, I made 3 calls. 2 of them came back clean. The third one." A pause. "The third one called me back from a number I didn't recognize and told me to stand down pending review. I'm running parallel. I've got 2 agents I trust who are moving independent of the regional chain. Ellison, they deployed a state air asset. I didn't authorize that. Someone above me is running a separate track. I know about the helicopter. Then you know this is bigger than I can manage from the field office." Another pause. "I need you to get somewhere defensible with a clear communications line. I'm working the federal angle from here, but if something happens to you before I can get assets in place." "What's your timeline?" 6 hours, maybe 4, if things break right." "Sandhu, I don't have 4 hours. I have approximately." She looked at Caleb, who held up 3 fingers. 30 minutes before we're in the open again, and Harlan reacquires us." "Then I need you to do something you're not going to like," Sandhu said. "I need you to call the one number you've been avoiding." Mara went quiet. She knew what number Sandhu meant. She'd had it for 3 weeks, and she'd been unwilling to use it, because using it meant admitting that the corruption ran deep enough that she couldn't handle it through channels she controlled. And that admission had felt, right up until about 10 minutes ago, like a defeat. It didn't feel like a defeat anymore. It felt like arithmetic. "Give me a signal verified channel," Mara said. Sandhu gave her a frequency and an authentication sequence. Looked at the satellite communicator in her hand. Looked at the road ahead, where the tree line was beginning to thin and the pre-dawn gray was spreading across the eastern ridge in a cold, specific light that meant morning was coming whether they were ready for it or not. She keyed the frequency. It was answered in 11 seconds, which meant someone was already monitoring it. "This is Detective Mara Ellison, Greyhaven PD, badge 774. I'm reporting active law enforcement corruption with state-level coverage, armed pursuit of a civilian and federal witness, and at least 1 officer whose status I cannot confirm." She paused. "I'm requesting direct federal intervention, and I'm giving you a location." She gave the location. There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough to be meaningful. A voice, measured and awake, and very deliberate, said, "Detective Ellison. We've been expecting this call." Mara looked at Caleb. He looked at her, and in the back seat, Sophie, who had been awake for the last 20 minutes and silent for all of them, said quietly, "Dad, there's a car behind us." Caleb checked the mirror. Headlights. 2 sets. Moving fast. Closing. He looked at the road ahead, and he looked at the mirror, and he looked at the road ahead again, and something in his face shifted, not fear. The opposite of fear the thing that lives on the other side of it, and his hand settled on the wheel with a specific, final quality, like a man picking up a tool he knows how to use. "Hold on," he said. He pressed the accelerator to the floor. The SUV hit 80 on a road that was rated for 45. Caleb didn't fight the vehicle, he drove it the way you drive ice, which was to say he drove with it, letting the rear end find its own slide on the curves and correcting early, late, steering into the drift before it could become a spin. The headlights behind them were losing ground on the straightaways but catching up on the curves, which told him the pursuit vehicles had better tires than the county SUV they'd borrowed from Officer Reyes. "How far to the highway?" he said. Mara had the GPS. 3 miles. "But they'll have the junction covered." "Junction or the road itself?" She looked at the unit. "Junction. There's no pull-off between here and there. They can't stage on this road without blocking their own people. Then we have 3 miles. At this speed." In the back seat, Sophie had both hands on the door handle, not from panic. From the same practical instinct that had her folding protein bar wrappers, she was braced correctly, the way she'd been shown to brace. Koda was flat across her lap, his weight distributed low, which was either trained behavior or animal intelligence about moving vehicles. Mara suspected both. The first pursuing vehicle was 120 yards back. The second was another 50 behind that. Yes, they were running with lights, now full pursuit lighting, which meant stopped caring about visibility protocols, which meant Harlan had authorized a full intercept rather than a surveillance tail, which meant he'd decided that the outcome of the next few minutes mattered more to him than what it would look like in a report. "He's going to have someone at the junction," Caleb said. "Not just a blocker. He's going to be there himself." She looked at him. "How do you figure that?" "Because everything up to this point has been managed through subordinates, and it hasn't worked," Caleb said. "Twice. 3 times if you count the river. He's the kind of man who, when his people keep failing, decides to stop delegating." She thought about Harlan. 4 years of watching him. The way he ran briefings always at the front of the room, never delegating the presentation itself. The way he handled cases that had gone sideways. He didn't send someone else to deliver bad news to the chain of command. He went himself, controlled the framing, stayed at the center of the information flow. She said, "He'll be there. Then I need to know something." "What? Is there anything about this man's tactical capability that I should know about? Military background, shooting record, anything?" She thought for a moment. "He qualified expert 3 years running," she said. "Before that, 8 years Billings PD, 2 years on their SWAT entry team. Building clearance, he knows dynamic entry. He's not," she paused. "He's not a trained field operator. He's not an amateur." Caleb absorbed this the way he absorbed most information, which was without visible reaction and without apparent storage. It simply went somewhere in him and became part of the calculation. "Okay," he said. The road curved south and the valley floor opened below them, and she could see the highway junction. A mile ahead, set a 4-way intersection with a gas station on the northwest corner that was closed at this hour, its fluorescent canopy lights still burning uselessly over empty pumps. And at the junction itself, blocking the eastbound lane, a vehicle, the shape of a department command unit, the larger SUV format that carried equipment and commanders. One figure standing outside it. Even at this distance in the gray pre-dawn, Mara knew the posture. Victor Harlan was exactly where Caleb had said he'd be. Caleb took his foot off the gas. Not off the brake, off the gas, letting the vehicle decelerate naturally so the pursuing vehicles would close the distance, which seemed exactly wrong until Mara understood what he was doing. If they hit the junction at 80 with Harlan's vehicle blocking the road and 2 pursuit vehicles 30 seconds behind them, they had no exit geometry. But if they slowed, if Harlan saw them slowing, he might read it as a surrender approach, and a commander reading a surrender approach adjusted his own positioning, stepped forward, prepared for an arrest scenario instead of an intercept scenario. With 6 seconds of managed ambiguity, Caleb used all 6. At 300 yards from the junction, he could see Harlan clearly now. The man had moved forward from his vehicle, which was exactly what Caleb had predicted, and he had his weapon drawn and held at a low ready, and his posture had the specific quality of someone who believed they had already won and were now managing the paperwork of it. He was wrong about that. At 250 yards, Harlan raised his weapon. At 200 yards, he fired. The round took out the passenger side mirror in an explosion of glass and plastic, and Mara's head went left on pure reflex, and she felt the displaced air of the shot through the open window frame. Down, Caleb said. She was already down. Sophie was already flat across Koda in the back seat. Caleb did not go down. He kept his eyes on the road, both hands on the wheel. 150 yards, he did something that Mara would reconstruct afterward, in the specific way you reconstruct moments that happen faster than your processing. He accelerated. Gradually. Full throttle from a near stop. The county SUV's engine producing a sound that was more outrage than power as the tires bit and the vehicle lunged forward. And Harlan, who had been positioning for a controlled stop and a drawn arrest, had approximately 2 seconds to understand that what was coming at him was not a vehicle that was stopping. He moved. He dove left, away from his command unit, and the SUV hit the front core panel of Harlan's vehicle at 47 miles per hour. And the impact was not a clean cinematic collision. It was loud and chaotic and wrong-sounding. On metal, with a secondary crunch as both vehicles rotated, and the county SUV spun across the junction and came to rest facing north, with steam beginning to rise from the crumpled hood. Silence for approximately 1 second. Then Caleb was out of the vehicle. He didn't run to Harlan. He moved to the back passenger door first, opened it, looked at Sophie. "Are you hurt?" She was shaking. First time she'd shown it. She said, "Koda." The dog lifted his head, intact. He looked at Mara, who was already out of the passenger side, with her hand pressed to a cut above her right eyebrow, where her head had contacted the door frame on impact. Deep, bleeding steadily in the way scalp wounds do. "I'm fine," she said before he asked. Harlan, they both looked. The commander was on his feet. He'd come down hard on his left side when he dove. His jacket was torn at the shoulder. No, and he was moving that arm carefully, which meant the shoulder had taken the impact. But he was up, and he had his weapon in his right hand, and his right hand was functional, and he was looking at Caleb with an expression that had passed entirely through surprise and arrived at something colder. The 2 pursuit vehicles had reached the junction and stopped. Mara could see doors opening, officers stepping out, and the geometry of the next 30 seconds began to resolve itself in her head with a clarity that was almost calm, because when she stripped away everything else, the situation was simple. Harlan had 6 armed officers, and she had Caleb Mercer and a handgun with 1 magazine. The math was terrible. Harlan raised his weapon. Not at Mara. At Caleb. "Get on the ground," Harlan said. His voice was the voice she'd heard run 100 briefings measured, authoritative, the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed. "Hands where I can see them." Caleb didn't move. He was standing at the rear of the wrecked SUV, and he was looking at Harlan with no particular expression, and his hands were at his sides. "I said, get," "I heard you," Caleb said. "Then comply." The word landed in the cold air like a dropped tool. Harlan's eyes moved to Mara, then back to Caleb. Then did a brief, involuntary assessment of Caleb's physical presence, the kind of assessment that happens below conscious decision-making, the kind that sometimes tells you something the conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. "Who are you?" Harlan said. "Caleb Mercer." "That doesn't mean anything to me," Caleb said. "It wouldn't." One of Harlan's officers had moved to the commander's right flank. A second was moving to get an angle on Caleb's left. Professional spacing, Harlan's people were well trained. Mara had to give him that. They were positioning for a controlled takedown, maintaining fields of fire that didn't cross, using the vehicles as partial cover. Caleb tracked all of it without appearing to move his eyes. He said quietly, "The satellite communicator. Is the channel still open?" She checked. She'd kept it keyed. "Yes." Then whoever's on the other end of it just heard all of this. She looked at the device in her hand. He was right. She lifted it to her mouth. "This is Detective Ellison. We are at the Route 9 junction, Highway 12. Commander Victor Harlan has a weapon drawn on unarmed civilians. We need federal response at this location immediately." Harlan looked at the communicator. Something moved in his face for the first time, not fear, but the recognition of a variable he hadn't accounted for. "That line isn't secure," he said. "No," Mara said. "It isn't. You have no idea what you've done." "I have some idea." She held his gaze. "I found your warehouse, Victor. I found the manifest. I found the shell company, and I found the name on the registration, and I gave all of it to the FBI 6 hours ago." She paused. "The question I've been sitting with all night is whether you knew about the state-level coverage, or whether someone above you was using you the same way you were using everyone else." Something's in his jaw tightened. That answered that question. He hadn't known the full shape of what he was part of. He'd been a node, not a principal. Useful, protected, managed, and somewhere above him, someone had been treating Harlan the way Harlan treated his officers, as a tool with a disposal date. She watched him process this. It didn't make him less dangerous. It made him more dangerous, the way cornered things always are. "Put the weapon down, Victor," she said. "You're a fugitive," he said. "You assaulted Officer Reyes," Caleb said, "is walking down a Forest Service road right now with his keys and his phone and a story that's going to read very differently from yours when it's written down." Harlan looked at him. "And you," he said, "you've no standing here. You're a private citizen who has interfered with a law enforcement operation, who has stolen a county vehicle, who has shot at an unarmed man," Caleb said, in front of witnesses, "on a channel that's been open to a federal line for the last 4 minutes. A silence. Harlan's weapon arm hadn't wavered. The two flanking officers held position. From the east, the direction of the highway, a sound. Rotors this time. Not a single vehicle. Multiple vehicles, and beneath the engine sound, if you were listening for it, the specific frequency of radios running simultaneous traffic. Harlan heard it. His eyes went to the eastern horizon. The first vehicle came over the low rise on the highway, at speed dark, full-sized federal plates, light bar across the roof running silent, and then the second, and then a third. By the time the fourth vehicle appeared, Harlan's flanking officers had stopped moving and were looking at each other with the specific expression of people who have just understood that the situation thought they were managing has been managing them. Exhaled. Long, slow, complete. The federal vehicles reached the junction and spread in a practiced arc, and the doors opened with the coordinated rhythm of people who had drilled this movement, and the men and women who stepped out were wearing jackets that said things Mara had spent 6 weeks hoping to see, and the first one to speak identified herself at volume and with authority and directed all weapons to be lowered. Harlan lowered his weapon. He did it slowly, with the specific quality of a man who was making a decision about the future, even as the present closed around him. He looked at Mara. "You have no idea," he said, "how far this goes. That's why I called people who get paid to find out," she said. An agent took the weapon from Harlan's hand. Another directed the flanking officers to separate. A third, a woman, short, in her 40s, with the kind of face that had spent years being underestimated, walked directly to Mara. "Detective Ellison." "Yes, Special Agent Carla Weiss. We spoke 14 minutes ago on the secure line." She looked at Mara's forehead. "You need to get that looked at." "I need a lot of things looked at," Mara said. "That's probably third on the list." Weiss looked at Caleb. A longer look, the kind of look that wasn't unfriendly but was thorough. "And you're Mercer?" "Yeah, Caleb Mercer. Former Navy SEAL, rank of Chief Petty Officer, detached from SEAL Team 7 in 2019. After she stopped, Caleb met her eyes and waited. She chose not to finish the sentence. "After your service concluded," she said. "Yeah," he said again. "We're going to need a full statement." "I figured." "That's fine." Weiss looked at Sophie, who had climbed out of the rear of the wrecked SUV and was standing beside Caleb with Koda sitting at her feet. The agent's expression did something brief and involuntary at the sight of the 7-year-old. "There's a support unit 2 minutes out," she said. "We have a protocol for—" "She stays with me," Caleb said. "Mr. Mercer, she stays with me." Not loud, not hostile, the same immovable quality he'd had in his cabin doorway, talking to Officer Denton. Weiss looked at him for a moment. "She stays with you," she said. They processed them at the junction for 40 minutes before moving to a staging location 8 miles east, a county emergency management facility that the federal team had commandeered in the last hour. No, which was efficient, in the way federal operations were occasionally, briefly efficient before the institutional friction reasserted itself. Yes, Mara gave her initial statement in a room with a folding table and 2 chairs and a heating unit that worked intermittently. Agent Weiss sat across from her with a recorder and a notepad, and a second agent stood near the door, whose job Mara couldn't fully determine, but who she suspected was there to observe her affect, which was a standard protocol, and which she didn't resent. She gave the statement in order. Clean, detailed, from the moment she'd flagged the narcotics case to the moment the federal vehicles came over the rise on Highway 12. She didn't editorialize. She didn't minimize. She included the parts that reflected poorly on her own judgment, the decision to investigate alone, the delay in making federal contact, the specific mistakes that had allowed the situation to escalate to the point where a civilian and his child had been put in danger. Weiss listened without interrupting, made notes. When Mara finished, there was a pause. The name on the manifest, Weiss said. The registration principal for the Helena Shell Company. That name appears in an active federal investigation that predates your case by 2 years. Weiss set down her pen. I'm going to tell you something that I normally wouldn't tell a witness at this stage, because I think you've earned a partial picture. She paused. What you found in Greyhaven is not an isolated network. It's a spoke. There are at least 4 other spokes in the northwestern corridor, all of them connected to the same hub. We have been building toward the hub for 22 months. Mara sat with this. The field office closure 16 months ago, she said. The agent who was transferred to Anchorage was one of ours, Weiss said. Pulled deliberately to protect the investigation's integrity from premature action. You let Harlan keep running because you were building toward something above him. Yes, and the people Harlan moved product through. The people in those communities. Mara heard her own voice flatten. Wasn't an acceptable cost to you. Weiss looked at her steadily. Nothing about it was acceptable, she said. But federal investigations at this scale require decisions that are made above my pay grade and frequently above my comfort level. Now your evidence, combined with what we've built, gives us the predication to move on the hub. Weiss picked up her pen again. Which is why tonight matters. And why what you did matters. The parts of it that were improvised. Mara looked at the table. Warren Hale, she said. A pause. The Ranger is alive, Weiss said. He's injured. He'll need surgery. But he's alive and he's talking. Something in Mara's chest released that had been wound tight since she'd watched those cabin lights moving up the ridge. He gave them nothing useful, Weiss continued. According to his own account, he informed Harlan's officers that he maintained documentation of all activity on his mountain, and that the documentation was already transmitted to a federal contact. She paused. Wasn't, he was bluffing. Of course he was, Mara said. It bought time. That's what he said he was going to do. Weiss wrote something. Your contact, Agent Sandhu, she's being moved to a different supervisory chain pending review of the regional director's conduct. She flagged something to us 14 months ago that got buried. She flagged it again last night through a lateral channel. She's good. She's excellent, Weiss said. She's also going to be very busy. Caleb's interview was in a different room. Mara didn't see it. She heard Gettin see it, but she heard parts of it through the thin partition wall while she was waiting for the medical unit to address her forehead the specific flat cadence of his answers. The pauses that were longer than necessary, and which she'd come to understand, were not evasion, but the habit of a man who chose words carefully because he'd learned that imprecise words in high-stakes situations had consequences. She heard one exchange clearly. Your service record, mister. Mercer, specifically the period between that and 2016 and 2019. A pause. What about it? 3 tours, 2 of them in environments we can't fully discuss in this context. The commendations are classified, but the citations. I'd rather not. I understand, but for the purpose of this statement. I left, Caleb said. His wife died and I left. That's the relevant part. What I did before, that doesn't change what happened last night. Their pause. Longer. Fair enough, the interviewing agent said. Sat with that through the 3 stitches it took to close the cut on her forehead. When Caleb came out of the interview room, Sophie was asleep in a chair against the wall, with Koda lying across her feet, and Caleb's jacket over her shoulders. He stood and looked at her for a moment without approaching. The way he'd looked at her sleeping in the truck, that specific, particular quality of a parent's attention that isn't watching, over so much as it is a continuous, low-level accounting. She is here, she is okay, the inventory is complete. He looked up and found Mara looking at him. He crossed the room, sat in the chair on the other side of the small table where she was waiting for the medical unit to finish its paperwork. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "SEAL Team 7, she said. "You heard that. Walls are thin." He looked at his hands. They were clean, but there was a cut across the knuckle of his right index finger from the impact. She hadn't noticed it during the night. Or she'd noticed it, and it hadn't registered until now. "Is that why you were prepared?" she said. "The cabin, the cache, the tunnel, just caution. Specific preparation for a specific category of threat. I was prepared because I have a kid and I live alone in a remote location." He paused. "But yes, the training doesn't leave. You stop using it and it sits there. Until you need it." "Until you need it," he agreed. She looked at his hands. At the cut. "Your wife," she said, and then stopped, because she wasn't sure what the question was, or whether it was her question to ask. He didn't fill the silence. He let it sit. "Sophie was 3, he finally said. "It was fast. Aggressive cancer, the kind that doesn't give you time to argue with it." He turned the coffee cup on the table. Someone had brought them coffee, and it had gone cold. "I was on assignment when she was diagnosed. I made it back with 3 weeks left." He said it flatly, without the performance of grief. The way people carry things that are past the point of being performed. "I put in the paperwork the day after the funeral," he said, "and I found a place where it was quiet enough that I could raise her without the noise, without having to be anyone. You were hiding. I was raising my kid. Both things can be true." He looked at her, and she held the look, because it was an honest thing she'd said, and she wasn't going to walk it back. After a moment, something shifted in his face, yet not agreement exactly, but the acknowledgement that the statement had landed somewhere real. He said, "Both things can be true." By 8 in the morning, the emergency management facility had the particular controlled chaos of a major operation in its first hours. Federal agents moving in and out, radios running, civilian support staff setting up communications arrays. Someone had found a cot for Sophie in a back office. Koda was with her. Mara had confirmed twice that Koda was cleared to remain with the child, and the second time she'd confirmed it, she'd done so with a tone that didn't invite a third discussion of the matter. Harlan was in federal custody in a vehicle that had left the facility 40 minutes after his arrest, en route to a holding arrangement Weiss hadn't specified. His officers were being processed separately, each one interviewed to determine where on the spectrum between compliance and complicity they'd been operating. Officer Reyes had walked out of the forest at 6:17 in the morning with signal on his phone and had called a federal tip line rather than his department dispatch. Yet he'd intervened, which told Mara something important about where he'd landed when she'd given him the choice on the road. She was sitting with coffee that was marginally warmer than the last cup when Weiss came back into the main room and sat across from her without preamble. "I need to talk to you about next steps," Weiss said. "K, we're going to need Harlan isolated from any communication with the network above him for the next 72 hours while we move on the hub. That's in process." She set a folder on the table. "Your evidence, the warehouse, the manifest, the shell company documentation is being integrated with our existing case materials. You'll be credited as a contributing investigator." "I don't care about credit." "I know you don't. I'm telling you anyway, because in 6 months, when this goes to trial, you'll be on the stand, and the defense is going to try to characterize what you did as a rogue operation by an unstable officer. Yin clean and paper trail of your contribution to a federal investigation is the first piece of evidence that characterization is wrong." Mara hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd been operating entirely in present tense for the last 18 hours. "Okay," she said. "Your department, Greyhaven PD, is under review. The department is effectively suspended from independent operation pending audit. County Task Force is dissolved. Officers who weren't directly implicated are being temporarily reassigned to state jurisdiction." "How many were implicated?" Weiss paused. "Of 16 sworn officers, we're looking at 4 who had direct knowledge of the operation and were complicit. 3 more who likely knew something was wrong and chose not to ask. The rest," she opened the folder, closed it again, "appear to have been working in good faith in a compromised environment. My shift supervisor, in the second category. He passed your flag to Harlan and didn't follow it further. He's cooperating." Mara thought about that. About a man she'd worked beside for 3 years who had made the calculation that the safest thing to do with a problem was to give it to someone above him and stop looking at it. It wasn't complicity in the way that had teeth, but it was the kind of moral failure that quietly underpins the kind that does. And me, she said, what about you? My status. I've been operating outside of sanctioned channels for 6 weeks. I've stolen a county vehicle. You've been operating as a protected federal witness in an active investigation. Weiss said whether you knew that at the time or not. The unauthorized actions you took last night were taken under exigent circumstances while being actively pursued by armed officers acting under corrupt orders. She looked at Mara directly. You're not facing charges, detective. Mara looked at the table. She said again, he'll be Medivis to Missoula this morning. Family's been contacted. He doesn't have family. He told us he has a sister in Billings, Weiss said. He apparently hadn't spoken to her in 4 years. She's driving up. Mara thought about a man who kept a light on overnight and wrote everything down in a logbook because 22 years on a mountain had taught him that documentation mattered, who had stood in his own doorway and said, I'm the ranger, as if that were sufficient explanation for everything he was about to do. He needs to know what he did mattered, she said. Weiss paused. He already knows. He made sure of it before Harlan's people reached him. The logbook he gave you was a copy. Mara looked up. He kept the original, Weiss said. Locked in a cabinet they missed. It's in our possession now. Time-stamped, detailed, and corroborating every element of your account. 22 years of knowing his mountain. 22 years of writing things down. Mara looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked back at the table. What about Mercer, she said. What about him? His record. The cabin, the cash. The unlicensed weapon, she paused. He has a child, Agent Weiss. I don't want his cooperation last night. Mr. Mercer's record is classified at a level that makes his personal preparations legally ambiguous at best and protected at worst, Weiss said. His actions last night were consistent with protecting a federal witness from armed assault. He's not facing anything. She tilted her head slightly, although I'll note that he refused 3 separate offers of witness protection and to a federal securities escort. He would. He said. Weiss glanced at her notes, and something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a smile that she didn't complete. That he'd spent the last 4 years learning this particular mountain, and he wasn't interested in starting over on someone else's. Mara looked at the window. Outside, Montana winter, gray and impassive, the kind of morning that wouldn't get brighter than this. There's one more thing, Weiss said. Something in her tone changed. A fraction. Just enough. The name on the manifest, she said. The hub. What we know and what we can prove are still a significant distance apart. We're moving on it, but Ellison, the person above Harlan has resources and institutional reach that mean the next 72 hours are going to be, she chose the word carefully, turbulent. Turbulent for who? For everyone involved. Weiss closed the folder. I'm telling you this because you should know that what happened last night wasn't the end of something. It's the opening of something. Mara sat with that. Harlan said I had no idea how far it went, she said. Harlan was correct, Weiss said. But you did the one thing that mattered, which is that you documented it, and you got it to the right people before he could stop you. She stood. The rest is our problem now, is it? Weiss looked at her. Mara looked back. You're going to need a cooperating witness who knows Greyhaven from the inside, Mara said. The department, the county, the relationships, who can look at an organizational chart and tell you which connections are professional and which ones are something else. We have resources. You have federal agents who've been in this district for 22 months and still didn't know about the warehouse, Mara said. Unkindly. Just factually. I've been in Greyhaven for 6 years. Where people eat lunch. I know whose kids go to school together. Which businesses have county contracts and which ones got those contracts in years that don't match their revenue. She paused. You need me. Weiss studied her for a long moment. The Internal Affairs Division of the State Police is conducting a parallel review, she said. They've been asking for an embedded consultant with departmental knowledge. Then tell them they found one. Another pause. That would mean relocating from Greyhaven, Weiss said. At least initially. I know. It would mean your caseload, your seniority, what it would mean, Mara said. Tell them yes. Weiss nodded. Once.
The nod of
A woman who had asked a question she already knew the answer to, confirming the thing she'd suspected since the first phone call. She left the room. Mara sat alone for a moment. Then she got up, went to the back office where Sophie was sleeping on the cot, opened the door quietly, and stood in the doorway. The child was on her side with Koda curved against her back, the dog's chin on her knee. The rise and fall of her breathing was slow and even real sleep, the deep kind earned. Caleb was leaning against the wall beside the door. He'd been there, she realized, since they'd brought Sophie to the cot. He hadn't sat down. You should, she said. I know, he said. She's safe, Mara said. You can. She's Sophie. I just need to. He stopped. He didn't finish it, but she understood it. I just need to see it for a little longer. She stood beside him in the doorway and they looked at Sophie sleeping. And outside the window, the Montana sky was going from gray to the particular pale blue of a winter morning after a storm. And somewhere in a federal transport vehicle, Victor Harlan was thinking about lawyers and deals and how much he knew about the hub above him that he could trade for a reduced sentence. And somewhere in a Missoula hospital, Warren Hale was waking up from surgery with a sister driving toward him on an icy highway. And somewhere above all of it, a man whose name had been on a shipping manifest in a warehouse outside Greyhaven was receiving information through channels that were about to stop being secure and was beginning to understand that the careful architecture of 3 years was starting to come apart at the base. All of that was true, and also true. A 7-year-old girl breathing slowly in a borrowed cot in a government facility in the middle of Montana with a Belgian Malinois keeping watch over her feet, her small face slack and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in the 16 hours preceding this moment. Caleb watched her breathe. Mara watched him watch her. Pale blue of the winter morning spread across the window and held. He finally sat down at 9:14 in the morning. Because anyone told him to. Not because anyone told him to. Not because the situation had resolved itself into something that permitted rest. But because Sophie woke up, looked at her father standing in the doorway, and said, "Dad, sit down. You look terrible," with the flat accuracy of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to soften observations for the sake of social comfort. He sat down. Mara was still in the doorway when this happened, and she turned away to hide the expression on her face, which was the closest thing to a genuine smile she'd produced in 36 hours, and she walked back to the main room and let the two of them have the private territory of a father and daughter who had been through something and needed a few minutes without an audience. The facility was louder now. More agents, more vehicles outside, the radio traffic constant and overlapping. Someone had set up a proper communications array in the corner of the main room, and 2 technicians were running lines with the focused urgency of people who knew that a 72-hour window had opened, and that the first 12 hours of it were the most critical. Weiss was on a call in the far corner. Her back to the room, her posture, the specific posture of someone delivering information to a person above them who is not pleased with what they're hearing. Got coffee. Real coffee this time. Someone had brought an actual machine and a bag of ground beans, which felt disproportionately significant. She sat with it and thought about the next 72 hours, and then stopped thinking about the next 72 hours because there was nothing productive in it yet, and instead thought about the river. She thought about the specific black of the water under the ice. The way the cold had been absolute rather than incremental, not a gradual lowering of temperature, but an immediate systemic assault. Her body's systems registering the shock the way electrical systems register a surge, all at once and everywhere. She thought about the moment. She'd understood that the door wasn't going to open from inside, that the pressure differential had made the vehicle a sealed container, and the way her mind had gone very quiet in that moment, not panicked, resigned, just very quiet, working the problem. She'd gotten out because she'd stayed quiet. She'd survived because Koda had pulled her toward an opening in the ice she couldn't see. She'd made it through the night because a man she'd never met had been standing in the right place at the right moment and had made a decision in 90 seconds that most people wouldn't have made with 90 hours. She thought about all of that and drank the coffee and let it settle into something she could carry. Weiss came off her call at 10:30 and crossed directly to Mara. "The hub," she said, without sitting down. "What happened?" "We moved on it 40 minutes ago. Coordinated with 3 other field offices, Seattle, Denver, and Salt Lake. 14 arrests. The primary target," she paused, "was not at the registered address." Set down the coffee cup. He ran. He had approximately 6 hours of warning. From to the time, we coordinated the takedown. Weiss's expression was controlled in the way of someone managing professional disappointment. He was good. He had an exit plan. He's gone. He's not gone. He crossed into Canada at a remote crossing in northern Idaho at approximately 8 this morning. We have the vehicle, we have the crossing record, and we have federal cooperation requests filed with the RCMP as of 45 minutes ago. She paused. He's not gone. He's running. Those are different things. How different? The man has been building this network for 11 years. He has resources, he has contacts, and he has the kind of institutional knowledge that makes him valuable to people who shouldn't have him. Weiss finally sat. But he also just abandoned 11 years of infrastructure in 6 hours, which means he's operating on fear rather than strategy. And people operating on fear make mistakes. How long does it take to catch someone running on fear across the Canadian border? Weeks, maybe months. Weiss held her gaze. But it happens. Looked at the table. The part of her that was a detective, the part that had flagged a narcotics case, and pulled a thread and followed it until it nearly killed her, understood that this was how these things worked. Clean, not complete, not the tidy resolution where every door closed simultaneously. You got most of it. You built the case on what you had. The rest was time and patience and the grinding institutional work that she'd spent 6 years doing, and that she'd now be doing from a different position, with a different mandate. The 14 arrests, she said. Prosecutable. The evidence chain is solid. Weiss paused. Because of what you built. Harlan, cooperating. Aggressively. A slight dryness in Weiss's voice. He appears to have decided very quickly that the person above him in this structure is not someone he wants to be loyal to. She paused. He's going to prison regardless. But his cooperation changes the sentence range, and it confirms information we couldn't have gotten otherwise. He'll spend the rest of his life inside. Very likely. Mara thought about Victor Harlan, running briefings. Harlan at award ceremonies. Harlan mentoring young officers with the specific attentiveness that she'd mistaken for genuine investment, that she understood now had been the maintenance of an asset loyalty purchased with the appearance of care. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. Not satisfaction. Relief, exactly. Something flatter and more enduring than either the particular exhaustion of having been right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about. And the officers who were complicit, she said, charged. The ones in the second category, the ones who knew something was wrong and looked away, will be handled through administrative proceedings rather than criminal prosecution in most cases. It depends on the specific facts. Weiss paused. Your shift supervisor entered a cooperation agreement this morning. Mara absorbed this. She didn't say anything about it because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have been more about her own feelings than about the facts. And the facts were already complicated enough. And Greyhaven PD, she said, the department will be reconstituted under state oversight. Command structure, independent review board, the full remediation package. It'll take 6 to 12 months before it's operational again as an independent entity. Weiss looked at her, which is one reason why the embedded consultant position with state internal affairs is not a short assignment. You said yes without asking how long. I know, Mara said again. Weiss looked at her for a moment with something that was difficult to classify, not exactly respect. Because Weiss was too experienced to attach something as personal as respect to operational decisions, but something adjacent to it, acknowledgement of one professional by another, that a choice had been made with clear eyes. The position is formally offered, Weiss said. You'll need to report to the State Division in Helena within the week for orientation. She slid a card across the table. Director's direct line. He's expecting your call. Picked up the card. She looked at it. A state police emblem, a name, a number. The weight of it was negligible. The way the weight of all significant things is negligible in itself. It's only what they represent that has mass. She put the card in her jacket pocket. Sandhu, she said. Is she okay? She's fine. Better than fine, she's been formally assigned to the task force continuation. Her regional director is currently the subject of an independent review. She's effectively operating outside his authority for the duration. Weiss allowed herself something that was almost a smile. She called me this morning to ask about you. I told her you'd accepted the IA position. She said, and I'm quoting directly, obviously. Mara laughed. It surprised her, the sound of it, the involuntary completeness of it. She hadn't expected to laugh this morning. She suspected Weiss hadn't expected it either, from the slight adjustment in the agent's expression. "Tell her I'll call her," Mara said. "You can tell her yourself. She wants to have dinner at some point." She said, "When this is all over," which is a meaningless timeline. "Completely meaningless," Weiss agreed. "But the intent is genuine." At noon, the federal team allowed Caleb and Sophie to leave the facility with a security escort that Caleb declined. The declining took approximately 3 minutes and required Weiss's personal intervention to resolve, and it resolved in Caleb's favor, which Mara noted from across the room as further evidence of something she'd been assembling for the last 18 hours and still didn't have a clean name for. They found her before they left. Sophie came first, the way she always moved ahead of her father, direct, without the social hedging that most adults performed. "You staying here?" Sophie said. "For a little while," Mara said. "I have some things to sort out." "Are the bad people in jail?" "Most of them." Sophie considered this with the precision she applied to most things. "Is pretty good," she said. "Yeah," Mara said. "It's pretty good. Are you going to come see us?" Mara looked at Caleb, who was standing behind his daughter with his hands in his jacket pockets, an expression that was carefully in the way things are carefully neutral when they're not actually neutral. "I'd like to," she said. "If that's okay. You can have the room next to mine," Sophie said. "It has a window that faces the river." She paused. "The river is actually nice when nobody's drowning in it." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Sophie said, "It's true. It's true. She probably doesn't want to be reminded of drowning. Maybe don't remind her." Sophie looked at Mara to assess whether the reminder had caused damage. "It's okay," Mara said. "She's right, the river is nice." Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went to find Koda, who moved to the facility's exterior door and was waiting there with the patience of an animal that understood the concept of departures. Caleb stood where he was. Mara stood where she was. There was a distance of about 6 feet between them, and the room around them was full of agents and equipment, and the continuous noise of a federal operation in motion, which was not the context either of them would have chosen for whatever this moment was. "No. These eye position," he said. "You heard that. Walls are thin," he said, using her words from the morning back at her. "Helena," she said. "I'll be based out of Helena. That's 4 hours. Roughly." He looked at the floor, then at her. 4 hours isn't terrible," he said. She agreed. "It isn't," he nodded. The same single nod he used for things that were decided. "Sophie likes you," he said. "I like Sophie. She doesn't like most people. She tolerates them. There's a difference, and she's very clear on it internally, even if she doesn't say it." Mara paused. "I like her the way you like someone who is going to be formidable and is only 7, so they don't know it yet." Something moved in his face. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly it. A beat, Caleb. Yeah, what you did last night. She stopped, because the sentence she'd been building didn't have an adequate end. What you risked was true but insufficient. What it cost you presumed things she didn't know. What it means was too large and too unformed. You didn't have to," he said, "but you did." "I know," he said again, and the repetition wasn't deflection, it was the whole answer. The calculus, and he'd made the choice, and he didn't need her to find the language for it, because he'd done it without language, and the language came after or not at all. She put out her hand. He looked at it. Then he took it, not a handshake, not quite, more the way you take something that's being offered carefully, and held it for a moment. 4 hours, she said. 4 hours, he said. He let go and walked to the door where his daughter and his dog were waiting, and he didn't look back, and she didn't need him to. She stayed at the facility for 3 more days. They were not comfortable days. They were the days of formal statements and chain of custody documentation, and the specific bureaucratic endurance required when a case that has been running hot suddenly needs to be built into. Something that will stand in a federal courtroom for years. She gave her formal statement once to Weiss's team, once to a DOJ attorney who had flown in from Washington and who asked questions with the focused persistence of someone being paid by the question rather than the hour. On the second day, she called Santu. They talked for an hour, which was 40 minutes longer than either of them had time for. And in that hour, they covered the case and the task force and Weiss's assessment of the regional director and Sandhu's decision to flag the information laterally and the particular professional loneliness of being the persons in an institution who sees something wrong and isn't sure who else sees it. Did you know, Mara said, when you set up the sealed package protocol, did you know it was going to be that bad? A pause on the line. I knew something was wrong, Sandhu said. I didn't know the shape of it. I just knew that the right move was to build a record that couldn't be made to disappear. Why did you trust me? Because you called me instead of going to your commander, Sandhu said. That told me everything I needed to know about what you'd already figured out. Sat with that. Sandhu. Yeah. When this is over, she started and then laughed, because they'd already agreed that the timeline was meaningless. When something that resembles over eventually happens, Sandhu said. I'm buying dinner. You're paying for the whole thing, Sandhu said. I've been running a secure comms line at 3 in the morning for a week. I've earned appetizers. On the third day, she drove to Missoula to see Warren Hale. He was in a room on the 4th floor of the hospital, a private room, which Mara suspected was Weiss's doing rather than Hale's insurance policy. He was propped up in the bed with a drainage tube on his left side, and a face that had more color than she'd expected. And when she knocked on the open door, he looked at her for a moment, and then said, You look better than the last time I saw you. You look worse, she said, but better than I thought you would. Sit down, he said. You're making the room feel military. She sat. The room smelled like antiseptic, and the particular floral arrangement that someone, the sister from Billings, she assumed had put on the windowsill. Outside the window, Missoula in January, gray and cold and real. They told me what you said to them, she said, that you had a federal contact, that the documentation was already transmitted. It wasn't. But they didn't know that. He adjusted himself against the pillow with the careful movement of a man with a tube in his side. 22 years on a mountain. You learn when to bluff. It bought up 40 minutes. I figured it would buy at least 30. He looked at the window. Sergeants at the station. A ranger from the district is feeding him. He's apparently not pleased. The cat, he doesn't like strangers. A pause. He'll get over it. Mara looked at the man in the hospital bed, the weathered face, the economical manner, the absolute absence of self-pity or drama about what had happened to him on his mountain because he'd chosen to stay behind and buy time for people he'd known for less than an hour. I need to say something, she said. You don't have to. I need to say it anyway. She leaned forward. What I did was my job, he said, firmly, without apology. I'm the ranger. This is my mountain. What happens on it is my business. He paused. What those people were doing on it was wrong. I documented it. When the time came, I acted on the documentation. He looked at her directly. That's the job. That's what you do when you know something is wrong. You write it down, and then you act on it. She thought about 6 weeks of pulling threads alone, about the sealed package protocol, about a logbook copied before danger arrived. Yeah, she said, that's what you do. They sat in the quiet room for a while after that. Before she left, she put the folded page from his original logbook on the table beside his bed. The copy he'd given her, which had traveled through a tunnel and a creek bed and a highway pursuit and 3 days of federal proceedings. The edges were worn. There was a bloodstain in one corner from her forehead wound. Evidence record has everything it needs, she said. That one's yours. He looked at it, didn't pick it up. Thank you, he said. She drove to Helena the following week. The drive was 5 hours with the road conditions, and she made it alone, which she'd chosen deliberately, not because she needed the solitude exactly, but because she needed the specific mental space that long drives in Montana provided, the kind that came from watching 100 miles of landscape move past a windshield at a steady speed with nothing demanding a response. She thought about a lot of things. She'd thought about Greyhaven and the 6 years she'd spent in it, which weren't wasted years even though they'd ended badly, because the work she'd done there, the actual work, the daily work of being a detective in a small department in a remote county had been real. And the cases she'd closed had stayed closed. And the people she'd helped had, regardless of what the person at the top of the organization had been doing with the department's name. She thought about what Weiss had said. You did the one thing that mattered. She thought about whether that was true and decided it was mostly true, with the caveat that she'd also made mistakes that had cost people had cost Hale, specifically, who had been put in a hospital bed because she'd made a phone call from a line that wasn't secure and then hadn't moved fast enough, was hers to carry. She'd carry it, but she wasn't going to let it rewrite the rest of the accounting, because the rest of the accounting was also real. She thought about Caleb. She thought about the way he'd stood beside her in the doorway of the back office, watching Sophie sleep, the absolute quality of his attention, the specific love that doesn't need to say anything because it's already in every other thing the person does. She thought about a man who had built a tunnel under his house and memorized a topographic map and trained a dog to operational standards and still described himself as just a guy trying to raise his kid. The way both things were true simultaneously in a way that she found genuinely interesting to think about. 4 hours wasn't nothing, but it also wasn't an obstacle. She got to Helena at 3 in the afternoon and checked into a motel that was clean and impersonal and temporary, which was exactly what she needed for the moment. She called the state police director's number from Weiss's card, and he answered on the second ring, and they talked for 20 minutes at the position about the position and the mandate and the expected timeline and the resources she'd have access to. And throughout the conversation, she felt the click of something settling, not perfectly, not without friction, but settling, way pieces settle when they finally found the orientation they were built for. When she hung up, she sat on the motel bed and looked at her hands. They were steady. 3 weeks later, Victor Harlan appeared in federal court for a preliminary hearing, was not in the courtroom. She was at her desk in the state police building in Helena, working through an internal affairs case file that had nothing to do with Greyhaven, learning the new architecture of her new position, building the institutional knowledge that would make her useful in a different context. She got a text from a DOJ contact at 3:17 in the afternoon. Harlan pled. Cooperation agreement accepted. Sentencing in 90 days. She read the text, put the phone face down on the desk, picked up the file she'd been working.
Yeah.
It wasn't the response she'd have predicted from herself 6 weeks ago. She'd expected something stronger: relief, satisfaction, the closing of a loop. What she felt instead was something quieter. The recognition that the plea was a logical consequence of a chain of events that had begun when she'd flagged a narcotics case and refused to look away from what it implied. And that logical consequences, when they finally arrive, feel less like victory and more like physics. She worked until 6. Then she drove 4 hours north. The cabin looked different, in the dark without danger in it. It looked like a home. The porch light was on. Caleb had left it on, and there was smoke coming from the chimney. And through the main window, she could see the glow of the wood stove, and the warm amber interior light, and the outline of a child sitting at a table with what appeared to be a large piece of paper spread across it. She knocked. The door opened before the second knock. Sophie looked up at her. "You came," she said. "I said I would." Dad said probably. Sophie stepped back from the door. I said definitely. Mara stepped inside. The warmth of the cabin came at her all at once, wood fire warmth, the deep kind, layered and real. Koda came from somewhere behind the kitchen and pushed his head against her knee without fanfare, which she'd come to understand was his version of an enthusiastic greeting. Caleb came out of the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder and flour on his forearm, which was not a combination she'd have predicted from him, and which made her feel something warm and slightly off balance, in a way she decided to not examine too closely right this moment. "No. 4 hours," he said. 4.5. Road conditions. "There's food. Good. I didn't stop." "Why not?" "I wanted to get here," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the kitchen. 20 minutes, he said. She sat at the table with Sophie, who immediately showed her the large piece of paper, which was a drawing complicated, detailed for a 7-year-old, depicting a forest and a tower, and what appeared to be a dog leaping across a creek bed. "Is that Koda?" Mara said. "Yes, this is you." Sophie pointed to a figure near the creek. "And this is Dad." The figure representing Caleb was notably taller than the other figures. He was also carrying something, a rectangle, she realized. "What's he holding?" she said. "The map," Sophie said. "He always has the map." "He does," Mara agreed. Sophie looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated assessment she'd been applying since their first meeting. "Are you going to stay for breakfast?" she said. "I'm staying for dinner," Mara said. I'll have to see about breakfast. Sophie appeared to accept this as a reasonable answer to a reasonable question, and went back to adding details to her drawing: more trees, more snow, the specific visual patience of a child who knew what she wanted the thing to look like and was willing to work toward it. Watched her draw. They ate at the same table where the topographic map had been spread 3 weeks as earlier. The food was simple soup, bread, a pot of strong coffee, and conversation moved through ordinary things. Sophie's school, which she attended by a distance learning program, and which she characterized as fine, but not very interesting, and the state of the access road, which had been plowed twice in the last week, and a family of elk that had come through the south property line on Tuesday morning. After Sophie went to bed, she went herself, on her own clock, with Koda following and no reminder required. Caleb and Mara sat on the porch with the coffee going cold between them and the Montana night laid out in every direction, clear and enormous and indifferent in the specific the places that have existed for a very long time and will go on existing long after whatever is currently happening in them is resolved. The plea, he said. You heard, I have sources. She looked at him. Weiss called, he said. She wanted to confirm you were informed before it was public. She didn't call me. She called me. He looked into the dark. I think she was checking on me. Were you? Was I what? K. He thought about it with the seriousness he applied to most things. I'm okay, he said. He stopped. I've been better in terms of sleep. But that's not new. The nightmares. Yeah. She didn't push it. She let it sit in the space between them where it was truthful and sufficient and didn't need to be resolved tonight. Harlan said life, he said, 90 days to sentencing. The cooperation agreement changes the range, but the network evidence puts a floor on it. She paused. He's not coming out. Caleb nodded. And the man above him? Still running. She looked at the sky. They'll get him. It's a matter of time and operational patience, and I'm not sure I'll be involved when it happens. Does that bother you? She considered the question honestly. Less than I thought it would, she said. I wanted Harlan. He was the one who touched my case, my department, my community. The one above him is, she paused, someone else's Harlan. And somewhere there's a detective who's going to find the right thread and pull it. Because that's the job. Because that's the job. He looked at her. You sound like Hale, he said. Hale's a smart man. He's out of the hospital, Caleb said. Back at the station as of Tuesday. The cat was apparently extremely displeased with him for being gone. He told me. He called last week. He called you? He wanted the number for Weiss' team. Found something in his records from 8 months ago. A vehicle he'd logged on the North Ridge that he thinks might be connected to a supply route for the network. She paused. He's documenting it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Of course he is, he said. The coffee had gone completely cold. Neither of them moved to do anything about it.
I'm not going to be able to tell you how this next part goes, Mara said.
The IA work. The task force continuation. I don't know the timeline. I don't know what it's going to demand. It might be. Mara. He looked at her with the same quality of attention he used for things that were decided. I spent 4 years building a life in one place at one speed. He stopped. I'm not looking for someone to fit into the thing I already built. That's not what I'm looking for. What are you looking for? A pause. I don't know yet, he said. But I know it doesn't require a fixed timeline or a predictable schedule. He looked at the dark. Sophie asked me this morning if you were coming back. What did you tell her? I told her probably. She told me you said probably. Was the honest answer at the time. And now? He turned to look at her. Definitely, he said. 1 year later, on a day in January, when the black was frozen edge to edge, and the sky above Greyhaven was the specific pale blue of a Montana winter that had decided, at least for one afternoon, to be beautiful rather than brutal. Mara Ellison and Caleb Mercer were married beside the river. It was not a large ceremony. It was not a particularly organized one. The officiant was a retired state judge who had known Caleb's father and who drove 3 hours in questionable road conditions without complaint. Warren Hale attended with his arm still in a partial support brace and his cat inexplicably present in a carrier that he set down near the bank and opened, as if Sargent had earned the right to witness things by virtue of surviving them. Sandu flew in from Missoula and stood next to Mara and did not cry, though the effort was visible. 2 agents from Weiss's team came without being asked, which Weiss later claimed she had nothing to do with. Sophie stood beside her father and held the rings in a small tin box that she decorated herself with careful, deliberate drawings of horses and trees, and a dog that looked exactly like Koda. Koda sat at Sophie's feet and watched the river with the same absolute attention he'd applied to the tree line outside a cabin on a night that felt, from this distance, like something that had happened to different people in a different year. The cold was identical and the water was the same water, and the man who'd come down to the bank that night was standing in the same place he'd stood when he pulled a stranger out of the dark. The judge said the necessary words. Caleb and Mara said their words, which were short and direct, and entirely their own. They'd written them separately and read them to each other the night before in the cabin kitchen, which had resulted in a conversation that lasted until 2 in the morning and included one argument about a specific phrasing that Mara won and that Caleb later admitted she'd been right about. When it was finished, Sophie stepped forward and handed the tin to her father with the gravity of a child performing a task she has taken seriously. He took it, looked at his daughter. "You did good," he said, she said. And then, because she was 8 years old and had inherited the specific unsentimental directness of the man standing in front of her, "Can we eat now? It's cold." The laugh that went through the small gathering on the riverbank was not polished or cinematic, was the real kind, involuntary, irregular, the sound of people who have been through something and come out the other side and found that the other side contains, among other things, an 8-year-old who wants lunch. The black cut moved beneath its ice in the steady, indifferent way of water that has its own agenda and has always had its own agenda, regardless of what happens on its banks. The sky held its pale blue. The cold was absolute and specific and present, and the people on the bank were alive in it, imperfect and tired, and changed by things they hadn't asked for, standing in the place where the worst night of their lives had started and choosing, deliberately, to let it also be this, is the only real kind of strength, not the kind that stops the darkness, the kind that decides what to build in the light that comes after.